You were looking at cell phone video shot by a woman who says she was targeted by this guy.
April 26th, 2016, Yulee, Florida, 12:30 p.m. A man enters a large department store. He walks over to the personal care section and places several razors into his handheld cart. But then, just 90 seconds after entering, he approaches a young woman shopping for bathing suits.
He comes up to her and he's asking her questions. Initially, it sounds pretty innocent. He's asking for some help by shopping for his wife.
Let me make sure it's not too sheer or clear.
So, she's trying to help him out.
But the man's questions quickly take a creepy turn.
He starts asking very odd things like, do you think that this will be see-through? Do you think that my wife's underwear will show? Who is this guy? Has he been following her? What is he up to? What does he want?
And there's something even more chilling. The woman realizes that she's seen this man before. And that's when she flips on her camera phone and begins to secretly record this deeply troubling encounter.
I was gonna maybe get a backup here, but just want to make sure it's not too sheer or clear.
Right. Do you remember running into me in the grocery store?
When the man realizes the woman knows who he is, he turns and races out.
No, hey, where are you going? Come back. Hey, get this guy. Stop him. Stop this guy. Stop him. Stop that.
Who is this guy? Why is this woman so angry at him? And what has he done to her before?
Call the cops on him. Call the cops.
35-year-old Candace Spivey is the woman who chases after the man. 2 years earlier, he had approached her exactly the same way.
So the first time that I encountered him, I was in the grocery store. He came up to me very casually and he started talking about how it was his wife's and his anniversary. And he just bought this maxi dress. He goes, so I was kind of, wondering, should she wear a jacket with this? He starts out very casual.
And then it's the same story. The man's questions grow increasingly personal and soon uncomfortably sexual.
He goes, well, what about her underwear? Should she wear full underwear? And when he mentions, should she shave? My eyes started wondering and I looked into his shopping cart and I noticed that he had different types of razors for both men and women. So while he's talking to you and asking you these questions, he's holding his phone like this.
What is he doing? Creeped out, Candace walks away from the strange man in disgust. But then she sees him approach another woman.
I followed him to the next aisle and I saw him from behind, and as he's holding his phone, you could see him recording her through his phone on the other side.
Why is this guy secretly videotaping women in the store while asking them inappropriate questions? Whatever he wants, Candace knows it's wrong.
I did call the police. They kicked him out of the grocery store, reported him. Of course, he wasn't doing anything illegal. So they didn't feel there was any reason to run his information or anything.
For Candace, it's an incredibly frustrating situation. She feels violated, but it's not illegal to videotape people in public places like a grocery store, with or without their consent.
When I got in my car, I actually sat there and I cried like a baby.
So, when Candace finds herself face to face with the same man 2 years later, she's absolutely stunned.
And I'm standing there looking at bathing suits and he's on my side. And I'm like, is this really happening right now?
Do you remember running into me in the grocery store?
In my mind, not this time.
Call the cops! Call the cops on him! Call the cops! Get where he's going! No, you!
A dramatic chase out of a Target in Yulee.
April 26, 2016. The summer heat arrives early in Florida, and 35-year-old Candace Spivey wants something new to wear to the beach.
I went in to get a bathing suit I wasn't even in there for 5 minutes before he came up to me.
A man approaches her in the swimsuit section and starts asking questions about a gift he's buying for his wife.
He goes, "Hi, I just bought this maxi dress for my wife, and I'm just worried about it being too sheer or clear."
His questions quickly become highly suggestive and inappropriate. That's when Candace realizes this is the very same man who approached her 2 years before. And this time, she isn't going to walk away.
I had it, and I was done. Done with creeps, done with people being predators and thinking that they can just prey on women. Just done.
So, she secretly starts to record their conversation.
But should we make sure it's not too like sheer or clear?
Right. Do you remember running into me in the grocery store? No, hey, where are you going? Come back. Hey.
My adrenaline was going, my nerves were going. I was not thinking, but I chased him out, not really knowing what to expect. Something about the video that nobody knows, there are about 12 Target employees behind me, running with me after him.
Get where going. No, you.
All I remember is how hot it was outside, how anxious I was to get an identity on him.
Follow this. No, I caught you, mother.
This was incredibly brave. You know, most people would say do not pursue someone who is a sexual predator. Because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what this guy's done in the past.
To Candace's frustration, the man gets away again. But store employees have already called 911. Police arrive a few minutes later and question him in a nearby parking lot. His name is Jeffrey Polizzi, a married man with, it turns out, a criminal record. He was convicted 7 years earlier in 2009 for an even more upsetting crime.
He was caught sliding his foot under changing rooms while girls were changing into bikinis. He had a camera inside of his shoe.
Back then, he was charged with video voyeurism, a criminal misdemeanor, and sentenced to 120 days in jail.
He is a video voyeur. He's not just filming you, he's streaming you. He's streaming you to a platform where multiple other people are paying to watch you unknowingly.
Candace is so furious and disgusted, she decides to take her story public and post the video she took on social media. And the response is overwhelming.
New details after this shocking video surfaced. A total of 74 women have come forward saying that Jeffrey Polizzi took photos and videos of them in dressing rooms.
The stunning number of victims underscores just how prolific this predator has been and how long he's been at it. The video gets over 2 million views, and Candace is hailed as a hero.
A lot of victims feel that they don't have justice and they're not safe until the person that violated them is caught. She was determined to not let him get away, and she wanted to take her power back, and she did.
But when she thinks back to that day, Candace has mixed feelings about her actions.
As courageous as it was and as good as it felt, you know, inside at that moment, it was really dumb.
Get this guy.
I could have ran out into a situation that would have ended my life. I definitely don't encourage anyone to do that because you don't know what the consequences could be. But chasing them like I did, it was one of those heat of the moment things.
Call the cop. Call the cops on him. Call the cop.
Coming up, when another brazen crime happens in a public place, Good Samaritans come to the rescue.
These two guys show up, and things get even more intense. They start fighting this guy.
September 8, 2018, 7 a.m. All is quiet outside a bank in Orlando, Florida. But then, the surveillance cameras capture a man creeping around the ATM machine.
What is this guy doing? Who is he?
It's quickly obvious he's up to no good.
All of a sudden, we see this guy come out of nowhere. He lunges into the vehicle and tries to rob the driver.
A routine trip to the ATM drive-thru becomes a nightmare for the elderly couple inside the car, as the man aggressively reaches through the window for the woman's purse. To escape, the female driver takes off. But incredibly, the suspect clings to the moving car, with half his body still halfway inside the window.
This is so scary. They must be thinking, why is this guy not leaving us alone?
The driver doesn't get far. Suddenly, the car comes to an abrupt stop.
What could be going on inside this car right now? What could he be doing to this driver?
The robber is still wrestling with the driver.
There's probably a really intense struggle. Somebody's not able to drive that car away.
Then, just as the situation becomes increasingly dire, something unexpected happens.
All of a sudden, we see two men running towards the vehicle. As soon as these guys realize something bad is happening, they spring into action.
These two Good Samaritans rushed into the situation, not really thinking about how they could get hurt. They were so focused on helping someone else.
The man dressed in black yanks the robber out of the window, and he's caught off guard. The thief looks like he's going to flee the scene.
This is extremely dangerous for someone to actually confront a crime while in progress, because now all of a sudden the tables can be turned onto that person.
But then, with no warning, the suspect spins around and charges towards the two Good Samaritans. It's now an all-out brawl, and they have no choice but to defend themselves.
One of them actually goes into a boxing stance. He's ready to take this guy on.
The robber takes a giant swing at one of the men, but he gives him a swift shove, which sends the thief running behind a building.
We see them leave camera view for a second. We see one of the Good Samaritans actually kicking at the attacker. It looks like they have the upper hand at this point.
The situation seems under control at last, but that all changes in an instant. The suspect does an about-face and runs full speed towards the man in black.
This Good Samaritan did not see this coming. He must be terrified.
His name is Leon Wright, a 53-year-old businessman. And just as the angry robber tries to tackle him, Leon quickly ducks out of the way, and the suspect once again runs off.
Okay, he's gone now, so this is about to end.
But to Leon's shock, the robber doesn't make a break for it after all. Instead, he turns around and once again charges right for him.
But he's not backing down. And then things go out of control.
That's when Leon sees something in the robber's hand that terrifies him.
When he turned around, he was in the light because he was underneath the awning of the bank. And that's when I saw the black box cutter in his hand.
The man has a knife.
This is when I realized this situation was a whole lot more serious than what I thought it was.
It's an all-out brawl at the ATM. Fists flying, adrenaline pumping, and a superhero Good Samaritan swinging. He's fighting to save the lives of strangers.
At that point, everything happened fast.
After rushing to the aid of an elderly couple who were being attacked, Leon Wright is now face-to-face with an armed robber.
And when he turned around, that's when I saw the blade in his hand.
When Leon came to the aid of the couple in the car, he had no idea he was putting his life on the line.
I just want him to go away. That's all I wanted.
It all begins when Leon hears someone honking a horn just as he's about to enter a store.
So I was gonna ignore it and keep on going, but then the horn was blowing nonstop. So I'm like, something's wrong.
Bank back there was closed. The Walmart over here was open. Somehow, while getting attacked, this woman had the clarity to put her car in drive and start honking her horn.
At first, as he races towards the car, Leon doesn't see the robber.
The reason I couldn't see the guy as I was approaching the car is because he was waist deep in the driver's window.
But then, the man in the passenger seat catches his attention.
And that's when he let the window down. He said, "Help us."
That's the moment Leon says it all clicked.
I kind of computed it real fast. They're leaving the bank. This guy is in the car. So I knew this guy was trying to like rob the people. At that point, I didn't even think. I just reacted.
Leon starts doing everything he can to get the violent robber away from the terrified elderly driver.
He was struggling with her trying to take whatever she had in her hand. He was not trying to come out of that car because he hadn't gotten what he came to get yet. I was banging in his back, so when I started pulling him, he came out the window.
That's when Leon says the robber gets angry.
So when he came out, I guess, you know, the natural instinct, so now he wanted to defend himself. So now he came out swinging.
Even with the other Good Samaritan helping, it feels like an uneven matchup to Leon.
I'm only 5'5". This guy he had to be at least 5'11", 6 foot tall.
But when his opponent trips behind the building, Leon thinks the fight's almost over.
I was trying to kick him, I was trying to punch him while he was down, and then he got back up. So, you know, I got rid of my boxing stand, but he started to run away, so I'm thinking, okay, this is done with.
But to Leon's surprise, the robber doesn't take the easy out and gets even more vicious.
He could have just ran through the hedges and would have disappeared into the dark. But I guess he said, before I leave, you know, I'm gonna cut this guy or something before I leave.
With the box cutter in his hand, the robber makes one last move, charging right for Leon.
I want to get away from this blade. And that's when I tried to back cut out of there.
Leon avoids the blade just in the nick of time, but stumbles backwards, crashing into the pavement.
I lost my footing, and I fell and I rolled over my wrist. Yeah, it was real bad.
As Leon picks himself up from the ground, the robber finally takes off for good. The couple in the car are shaken but unharmed. The other Good Samaritan, who turns out to be visiting from another state, is uninjured and calls 911. But Leon is in bad shape. He's rushed to the hospital for a broken wrist, fractured elbow, and dislocated shoulder.
I woke up, I had a cage. So I had screws and we had like a scalpel. That's when I was like, wow, you know, I was really in danger.
Leon's wife, Tati, is shocked when she sees her husband's injuries.
When I saw the video, I realized just how blessed we were that it ended just with a broken arm.
The suspect who put Leon in the hospital managed to evade police. And to this day, he remains unidentified and at large.
The suspect has now been on the run for 6 weeks, but investigators tell me they believe he's still in the area.
Several weeks later, the elderly male victim calls Leon to thank him and reveals some shocking information. That purse the robber tried so desperately to steal, it wasn't a purse at all.
And he was telling me that that package he was trying to get was an urn. It was her sister's ashes. They came from a funeral for her sister. That's why she didn't let it go, because the bag was her sister's remains.
Word spreads about the brave actions of Leon and the other Good Samaritan, and they're recognized for their heroism.
When I was chosen as the Orange County Citizen of the Year, I got this. I received a Carnegie Hero Medal as well.
Luckily, these guys came around when they did, because if not, who knows what could have happened.
Still, law enforcement advise that for anyone who encounters a crime in progress, it's best to call 911. Leon's wife agrees.
You don't know who has a gun. You just don't know.
But she is not at all surprised her husband put his life on the line for total strangers.
Leon is so selfless. Leon is a very loving, caring person.
Leon says he's just glad he was in the right place at the right time.
If I hadn't been there at that time, I don't know, that could have ended a whole lot worse for that lady.
Really bad.
I'm able to move on and still live my life, and she's got her life. So I'm just glad it ended the way it did, as opposed to the alternative.
Every month, more than 40 million Americans use rideshare apps. Both driver and passenger assume they'll get home safely. But sometimes the unthinkable happens.
Minutes later, as the passenger grabs the wheel.
No!
January 19th, 2019, Sacramento, California. It's just after 9:30 p.m. when a driver gets a request from the Corner Pocket Sports Bar in the Citrus Heights neighborhood.
This driver picks up this guy who's clearly drunk, and he's stumbling. He looks a bit sloppy. Probably nothing that this driver isn't accustomed to. He probably sees this all the time, especially if he works the night shift.
Right away, the passenger does something unusual for a ride-sharing service.
So what's interesting here is that the passenger is sitting in the front seat of the rideshare. That is something that police would generally not recommend.
Other than that, the ride starts out routinely. The car heads out of Citrus Heights and travels south on Highway 99. But moments later, the horror begins.
Man!
So this driver is stunned. He did not see this coming. And he immediately grabs the wheel back from this guy. And they're in this struggle. And he's fighting for his life because this guy could kill them both.
Then, as quickly as it started, the passenger appears to pass out.
His eyes roll back. You can see the driver looks a little relieved, like, thank goodness.
It seems as if disaster has been averted, and the driver's only thought is to get to safety as soon as possible.
But then he comes to again and makes a bigger grab for the wheel, now actually pulling the vehicle through lanes of traffic on a very busy highway.
We're not gonna die, man, but you gotta let go.
No, I love you, brother. I love you, brother. This driver now knows that he is in a world of trouble. That vehicle potentially could cause a chain reaction accident that you could very well be involved in.
What started as an ordinary rideshare has become a battle for survival.
The driver is terrified for his life, and you can hear his voice shaking.
Get off of me! No, you will. Get off of me!
The adrenaline is really pumping, and he's doing everything possible to stay alive. But this passenger is not letting go of the wheel. He is not giving up.
The driver does the only thing he can and brings the car to a stop in the middle of 8 lanes of fast-moving traffic.
Looks like the driver eventually pulls over.
You try to kill me?
But there's still a lot of traffic. You still see and hear cars going by, and he calls 911.
I have a crazy drunk Uber passenger who's grabbed my steering wheel, and if I drive the car, he's trying to wreck us.
Now, at a dead stop in the middle of Highway 99, one disaster has been averted. But it appears another has been created, and the danger is now even greater.
Anyone who's ever been to California knows that the California highways are very wide, very crowded, and people drive really fast. So not only is the rideshare driver stopped in the middle of a busy highway, but we have all the other vehicles around them who are at risk by them careening across the road at highway speed. And they're strapped in the car, and who knows if this occupant is armed or not. This is a potentially catastrophic situation.
We're learning about this Uber ride, Adrian, that turned into like a horror film.
This is truly unbelievable.
Dax Castro has been driving folks around Sacramento since 2015. He knows the city like the back of his hand.
You know, I've raised my kids here. I have 8 children, 7 boys and a girl. They're all mostly grown. Well, I had a 9-to-5 job, right? So, you know, I did it after work. So you go 5 p.m. until whenever.
But Dax never dreamed how close he would come to losing it all on the night of Friday, January 19th, 2019.
You know, you never think about the things that can happen to you. I mean, just in an instant, you know, one minute everything's great, and the next minute you don't have anything.
The day started out like any other.
The night I got off work and hopped in my car and started driving. So I got this thing for a passenger, and this person had a very low rating. And for me, it's kind of a game. When I feel like it, I kind of look at it and I go, you know what? I wonder why this guy's got such a low rating. I'm going to pick him up anyway.
Right around 9:30 p.m., Dax picks up the low-rated passenger from the Corner Pocket Sports Bar in Citrus Heights.
As he comes out, he's just obliterated drunk, just stumbling all over himself. He was a little guy. You know, he was probably 5'6", maybe 5'4". And I found out later he's got 2 kids and a wife. He worked at a grocery store. So he gets in the front seat. I didn't care. You know, people would ask, do you want me in the front or the back? Like, it's your ride, you're paying for it, whatever you want. So this didn't seem too out of the ordinary for a typical Friday night.
Dax drives towards an address in South Sacramento. They're heading southbound on Highway 99 when the unimaginable happens.
We swerve across 3 lanes of traffic, going 60 miles an hour on the freeway. I mean, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gonna kill somebody. We're gonna T-bone someone getting on the freeway right there. Man! Because it's right where 2 freeways merge.
Okay, buddy.
The only thing I could think to do was to slowly brake and stop. Because if I try to turn, we're going 90 degrees.
We're not gonna die, man, but you gotta let go.
So I thought, well, maybe if I can get all the traffic to slow down with me, we'll create a traffic break. That's why I decided to brake, because that was the thing I could control.
You gotta let go, man. I love you, brother.
Now, at a complete stop in the middle of Highway 99, with cars flying by on his left and right, Dax is trapped.
He doesn't know what this guy is going to do next. He doesn't know if this guy has a weapon. He doesn't know what this guy's up to. So he's really at this person's mercy at this point.
Luckily, within moments, another car pulls alongside Dax and offers assistance.
Can we stay here, right here? That'd be awesome if you could.
That driver did a fantastic job under the circumstances of getting that situation under control. And eventually the police do arrive.
Law enforcement's first order of business is to get Dax and his customer off the busy highway. With lights flashing, they proceed to a strip mall parking lot.
They rip him out of the car, and he's throwing up on the sidewalk. They've got him in a one of those paper hood, because I guess he spit on them.
Police arrest the man, Shu Vang, and Dax is finally free to go home to his wife and 8 children.
In the end, no one got hurt. Everybody went home safely, so, you know, thank God for that. But yeah, it was just, you know, after we were parked and the cops were taking my statement, all I could do was just put my head in my hands and just kind of let my emotions kind of go out. Because at that point, you know, in the moment, you're kind of fearless. But once that adrenaline starts to dwindle down, boy, it hits you hard.
Because he took brief control of the wheel, Shu Vang is charged with driving under the influence.
He had drunk 2 pitchers of beer, literally downed them, just showing off. You know, I went to court, I said my piece. He didn't look at me. His lawyer did all the speaking. And then in between then and sentencing, they made a deal. And we haven't been to sentencing since. So I don't know. This guy just made me scot-free, which is a shame to me.
In the days and weeks that follow, Dax does his best to get back behind the wheel, but he's haunted by the harrowing memories of that night.
And I tried to drive, and, you know, everybody that I got in the car with was a potential attacker. And I just felt kind of PTSD, and I start having heart palpitations, and get sweaty and all that.
Soon, the trauma becomes too much to bear, and Dax has no choice but to give up his once beloved side gig for good.
I can't do it. It's been taken away from me. And, you know, in the end, I have to calm down a bit here. I hope that people will understand that it is such a serious thing to take someone's life in your hands. And not only them, but their family members. My 8 children, my wife, all lives get changed because you decided to do something stupid.
Coming up, 3 lives caught in the path of a runaway boat.
And boat just gets closer and closer. They have to jump or die.
August 12th, 2017. It's a quiet morning on the Columbia River in northern Oregon.
It's a beautiful sunny day. We have friends aboard a fishing vessel. They're talking, they're laughing, they're fishing. Then, all of a sudden, we see a large-size vessel barreling down on them.
Within moments, the fishing boat's captain notices the impending danger and desperately tries to get the power boat's attention.
And boat just gets closer and closer. They have to be wondering, what is going on? This guy has to see them. Why is he not turning? Why is he not slowing down?
The larger vessel continues to barrel straight towards the hapless passengers, threatening a deadly disaster.
The thing that surprises me the most is the high rate of speed that this boat is traveling. They have seconds to react. It's not stopping, it's not turning. They have to jump or die.
The passengers on the fishing boat make a harrowing leap into the cold morning waters with not a second to spare. But the desperate dive to escape is only the beginning of the day's ordeal for Chris McMahon, Brian Mace, and Ronnie Durham, who consider themselves lucky to have survived.
Everything could have very well ended in a blink of an eye.
You're there doing something you enjoy with people that you consider to be friends, and all of a sudden, bam, you know, you went from a Disney movie to a horror film.
For these unfortunate friends, that morning's outing was meant to be the start of a relaxing annual getaway.
We worked together for 10 years and we've been fishing together the whole time. And I love it because it's beautiful out there. So it was him, myself, and a friend of his named Ronnie.
And as they prepare to set out in the early morning hours, Chris makes sure to get his GoPro cameras to catch all of the action.
This will be my 4th year as a full-time fishing guide. And I have a website and a YouTube channel called Angling Oregon, where we do fishing videos.
But Chris never imagines his camera will record these horrifying moments that are nearly his last.
The incident itself happened at about 8:20 in the morning. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour.
It was very peaceful, and I saw a large white boat coming towards our direction. It was probably 100, maybe 150 yards away. And I thought, okay, he's gonna see us, and then he's gonna veer off to either side and bypass us.
They continued to close the distance, and big boats like that just can't turn on a dime. No boat does. So that's why I jumped up and started waving my arms and yelling to try to get their attention. Hey! Oh my God! Fully expecting them to see me and turn.
None of it worked. And as fast as it was going, that distance closed very rapidly.
The oncoming 31-foot fiberglass powerboat is flying through the water between 30 and 40 miles an hour. In their 18-foot aluminum fishing boat, Chris, Brian, and Ronnie have only seconds to decide what to do.
It was either get run over or don't. We just all jumped off the boat.
When I jumped off the boat, I remember my right knee having excruciating pain because the boat actually hit my right knee.
And when these 3 friends hit the water, they soon discover that their struggle for survival has only just begun.
The scariest part of that whole incident was not what was caught on camera.
A relaxing fishing trip on the Columbia River in Oregon turns into a fight for survival when a 31-foot powerboat plows into a much smaller vessel.
I didn't realize how close it was, but you can see where Brian was as the bow of that boat comes through. You see his foot as he's just clearing the screen.
I had injuries to my right knee. That's what I felt the most. And I was struck by some of the debris that cut my arms and my hand.
But their harrowing ordeal is far from over.
It's possible that they can get swept up in a current or get tied up in a boat motor. It's just incredible the amount of danger that they're still in.
When I came up, the other boat was just clearing the front of my boat. And there was debris all over in the water. Ronnie and Brian popped up, kind of next to me. And then that's kind of when everybody started panicking a little bit and, the reality of things started settling in.
I was afraid because we were not wearing our life jackets, which was idiotic. And the current in that point of the river is very strong. The boat that we were on was probably 20 yards away from us. The top of it was crushed down. And I thought to myself, I have to get to the boat so that I can stay above water. But it was just kept getting further and further away.
As the wreckage of Chris's boat drifts out of reach and the boat that hit them finally slows down and turns around, Chris, Brian, and Ronnie desperately try to stay afloat in the powerful current.
Ronnie was not doing as well. Brian was complaining a little bit about a tight chest and having a hard time breathing. And then that's when I started kind of freaking out a little bit.
I had on a sweatshirt, I had sweatpants, I had bib overalls, I had rubber boots. Everything is filling up with water. And that's when Curtis came along.
Witnessing the accident from their small skiff nearly 100 yards away, Curtis Burnett and his 8-year-old daughter, Ayla, come racing to the rescue.
His boat was small enough we couldn't get in it, but I was hanging on the bow, Brian was hanging on one side, and Ronnie was hanging on the other.
Curtis begins to ferry them to larger vessels, but the nearest one is the last boat they want to see.
When Curtis grabbed us, the first boat he went to was the boat that ran us over. I really didn't want to be on the boat that just about killed us, because quite honestly, I didn't know how well I was going to react.
Chris refuses to board and is carried to another craft, while both Brian and Ronnie climb onto the very boat that ran them over. It turns out the driver is 75-year-old Marlon Larson, who was out that morning with his son-in-law and grandson.
The son-in-law and the grandson were frantic. The driver of the boat, I remember, turned around and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention."
The group rides to shore in tense silence. And once they dock at the marina, they are just glad to be alive.
There were already medical personnel waiting for us. I had to help Ronnie off of the boat, and we got her to the medics. And once Chris got back, we really didn't say anything to each other. We hugged each other. And it was very emotional that we had just gone through that. I firmly believe that had it not been for Curtis, we would not be here today.
The local sheriff and the U.S. Coast Guard open a criminal investigation. But Chris McMahon wants to get the story from the powerboat captain himself.
I met with him at a local restaurant, and the conversation didn't start off well because he started to tell me, he says, "Well, I want you to know this is really tragic for me too." And immediately that upset me. But I had my computer with me, and I queued up the video to the point of the accident. And I said, no, wait a minute. You need to watch what I lived through. And I hit play. He watched it. He actually was pretty upset. He was almost about in tears, at what he'd done to us.
Marlon Larson is charged with the reckless operation of a boat, 3 counts of recklessly endangering another person, and 3 counts of 4th-degree assault. All charges are dropped just a few months later, when Larson passes away from unrelated causes.
There was also a civil suit with Mr. Larson's boat insurance company. And once his insurance company's lawyer viewed the video, there really wasn't anything to say. There was no fight. We've settled, the lawsuit is done, everything's closed.
But while the legal proceedings may be over, the incident itself has left a lasting mark.
And when you come that close to dying, you really have to just sit back and reflect on what's important.
It's a very sobering experience to realize that I was just almost killed. I never want to have to go through that situation again, of that helpless feeling when you have people that you care about in the water. So you either wear a life jacket in my boat or you don't ride. I mean, it's just that simple.
The first sound is the wind slicing through concrete corridors, rattling loose window panes along a street that no longer exists. And then the silence breaks with a single question that still hangs in the air decades later. How does a man vanish in the center of Berlin, in broad daylight, without leaving a body, a witness, or a truth anyone can agree on? It is the winter of 1979. The city split like a scar, east and west staring at each other across checkpoints and suspicion. And somewhere between those lines a life collapses into a cold case that will refuse to stay buried. The morning begins ordinary, dangerously so. Trams hiss along frozen rails. Office workers pull their coats tight, breath turning white. Newsstands shout headlines about politics, espionage, another defection, another arrest. No one notices the man stepping out of a gray apartment block in Kreuzberg, because he looks like everyone else, mid-30s, neat coat, briefcase in hand, moving with the quiet urgency of routine. His name, according to records later dug up and argued over, is Klaus Richter. A technician, a translator, a courier. The files will disagree. What they will agree on is this. At 8:42 a.m., Klaus Richter leaves his building. At 8:57 a.m., he is last seen alive. The street is narrow, damp, the kind of place where footsteps echo too loudly. A neighbor will later claim she heard him humming. Another says he looked over his shoulder twice. Police reports note nothing unusual. Surveillance cameras are rare, grainy, often broken. Berlin in 1979 is a city of shadows, where information moves faster than people and trust moves nowhere at all. Klaus walks toward the U-Bahn station, past a bakery opening its doors, past a wall plastered with posters peeling like old skin. He never reaches the platform. By noon, his absence becomes a problem. Klaus does not miss work. He does not forget appointments. When his supervisor calls his apartment and no one answers, it feels wrong. When evening comes and the lights remain off, it feels dangerous. A missing person report is filed, thin and hesitant. The kind that doesn't yet understand it is the first page of something much darker. The police mark the time. They circle the block. They ask the neighbors. They write down contradictions and shrug at gaps. The first search finds nothing. No blood. No struggle. No briefcase. The apartment is neat, almost sterile. Bed made. Dishes washed. Passport in the drawer. Wallet gone. The radio still tuned to a news station, volume low, as if someone planned to return before the next bulletin. Investigators exchange looks they don't record. In Berlin, a missing wallet can mean many things. A missing passport can mean even more. By day 3, rumors start running faster than the investigation. Klaus was meeting someone. Klaus was planning to defect. Klaus was working for the wrong side. Cold War logic infects every assumption. The press gets hold of the story and sharpens it into a blade. Mysterious disappearance shocks divided city. Neighbors are suddenly witnesses. Co-workers become suspects. Everyone remembers something they forgot to mention before. One man swears he saw Klaus speaking to a woman near the station, tall, red scarf, foreign accent. A woman insists she heard arguing, a car door slamming, tires squealing. Another claims Klaus had been nervous for weeks, chain smoking, staring at nothing. None of these accounts align. All of them feel urgent. Police pin them to a board like insects, colorful, fragile, useless without context. Then the first real lead appears, and it changes everything. A taxi driver comes forward, days late, voice shaking. He says he picked up a man matching Klaus's description that morning, near the station, destination unclear. The passenger was distracted, kept checking his watch, asked twice if they were being followed. At a red light, the man suddenly opened the door, threw a few bills onto the seat, and vanished into foot traffic. The driver didn't think it mattered. In Berlin, paranoia is currency. But now, under fluorescent lights, it matters too much. Investigators trace the route backward, forward, sideways. They find nothing. No CCTV. No reliable witnesses. Just a ghost path through a city designed to swallow secrets. The case file grows heavier, thicker, more confused. Pages fill with stamps, signatures, blacked-out paragraphs. Certain names appear and disappear. Certain questions are never written down at all. By week 2, higher authorities take notice. Men in better coats, with quieter voices, start attending briefings. The tone changes. Less speculation. More closed doors. Klaus Richter is no longer just missing. He is sensitive. Potentially compromised. Potentially dangerous. The word abduction enters the conversation and refuses to leave. East or west. Internal or external. accident or execution. Every theory is discussed and quietly shelved. The community feels it next. People lock their doors earlier. They stop lingering on corners. In bars, conversations drop when strangers approach. Someone paints a question mark on the wall near Klaus's building. Someone else writes his name underneath and circles it in red. It looks like an accusation. It feels like a warning. Months pass. The seasons turn. Winter thaws into a gray spring, then into a summer that feels too bright for a story like this. Officially, the investigation continues. Unofficially, it stalls. Leads dry up. Witnesses recant. Files are moved to different departments. A new stamp appears on the folder, cold case. It is a quiet word for a violent thing. It means unanswered. It means unresolved. It means Klaus Richter has become an absence the city must live with. Years later, people will argue about whether the clues were always there, hidden in plain sight, ignored because they pointed somewhere inconvenient. They will argue about a train ticket found in an archive, dated but never used. About a coded note misfiled under the wrong name. About a photograph that surfaced too late, edges curled, showing a man who looks like Klaus standing in the background of a crowd, eyes fixed on the camera as if he knows he is being watched. But in 1979, none of that is known. All that exists is a cold morning, a man walking toward a station, and a city that watched him disappear without blinking. The case settles into the cracks of Berlin, into basements and archives and memories that will fade or sharpen depending on who is asking. And somewhere inside that silence, the truth waits, patient, incomplete, ready to rewrite everything once someone finally learns how to listen. By the time the case is officially stamped cold, Berlin has already absorbed Klaus Richter into its bloodstream of unanswered questions. But cold does not mean still. It means slow, subterranean. Moving beneath the surface where no one bothers to look unless they are desperate or curious enough to dig. In the autumn of 1980, a year after the disappearance, the file is reopened quietly, not because of public pressure or new witnesses, but because a clerk in a federal archive notices something that does not belong where it is. A thin carbon copy of a transit authorization slipped between unrelated documents, and signed, unstamped, dated the same morning Klaus vanished, bearing a route that curves too close to the inner border to be coincidence. The paper smells of dust and old ink when it lands on a desk in a different building, and the man reading it understands immediately why it was misplaced, why it survived only as a copy, why no one had connected it to the missing technician whose name still provokes uncomfortable pauses in meetings. The authorization suggests movement, controlled movement, the kind that requires permission, the kind that does not leave room for improvisation. It implies that Klaus Richter was not simply walking to work that morning. He was following instructions, or believing he was. Investigators reconstruct the timeline again, this time with quieter confidence, layering official movements over unofficial ones, aligning tram schedules with border patrol shifts, mapping blind spots where eyes were supposed to be watching but were not. They revisit the U-Bahn station where Klaus was last seen, measure distances between entrances, study maintenance logs, discover that a service corridor had been closed for repairs on paper but remained accessible in practice. In Berlin, paper lies more often than people do. A former station worker is interviewed, reluctantly, hands trembling around a cigarette he is not supposed to be smoking indoors. He remembers nothing at first, then too much. He remembers a man escorted through a restricted passage by someone wearing a coat without insignia. He remembers being told to forget what he saw, told it was an inspection. He remembers the man's face, pale, focused, not frightened, as if he had already made his peace with whatever waited at the other end of the corridor. When shown Klaus's photograph, the worker looks away before answering yes. The lead does not explode into answers, it leaks into them, slow and corrosive. Who had access to that corridor? Who issued the authorization? Who benefited from Klaus Richter leaving the public map without leaving a body behind? Names are whispered, never written, some belonging to agencies that officially do not operate where the incident occurred, others belonging to departments that insist they were not involved. Each denial adds weight to the suspicion. Each silence sharpens the outline of something carefully hidden. The press senses movement before it understands meaning. A short article appears in a late edition, buried between sports results and weather forecasts. New review of 1979 disappearance ordered. No details. No quotes. Just enough to reopen wounds in a community that had learned to live with uncertainty. Old neighbors talk again. Old theories resurface. Someone remembers a black sedan idling near the station that morning, engine running, plates obscured by grime. Someone else remembers a man matching Klaus's description weeks later, seen near a border crossing, beard grown, eyes hollow, pretending not to recognize anyone. Police follow the sedan story and hit a wall of bureaucracy, so thick it feels intentional. Vehicle logs are incomplete. Records have been destroyed according to retention policies that seem conveniently timed. A clerk admits off the record that certain files were removed for national reasons. It is a phrase that ends conversations. It is a phrase that turns investigators into spectators. Then, unexpectedly, the case tilts sideways. A body is found in a wooded area outside the city, uncovered by erosion after heavy rain. Skeletal remains tangled in roots and rusted wire. For a moment, the city holds its breath. Forensic teams work fast, meticulous, hopeful. Dental records are compared. Clothing fragments are analyzed. The conclusion arrives like a muted bell. Not Klaus Richter. The relief is uncomfortable. The disappointment even more so. The woods keep their secret, and Klaus remains unaccounted for. Privately, some investigators admit they had hoped for a body, any body, because bodies close cases, and this one refuses to close. Without physical proof, the theories multiply unchecked. One dominant narrative begins to take shape, supported by fragments rather than facts. Klaus Richter was a courier, knowingly or not, carrying information across invisible lines, and someone decided the risk outweighed his usefulness. He was intercepted, processed, erased. Not murdered in rage or panic, but neutralized with administrative efficiency. But there are cracks in this narrative, and they widen under scrutiny. Klaus's financial records show no sudden influx of money. His apartment shows no signs of espionage tradecraft. His colleagues describe him as competent but unremarkable, the kind of man who blends into background noise. If he was carrying secrets, he was an unlikely choice. Unless that was the point. A second piece of paper surfaces, this one discovered by chance during an unrelated audit. A handwritten note, coded but clumsy, tucked into a personnel file that should not exist. It references a handoff delayed and an asset unresponsive. The date matches. The language does not. It is too informal, too human. Analysts argue over its meaning. Some insist it refers to equipment. Others are not so sure. The handwriting matches, no one willing to admit authorship. As the investigation inches forward, political pressure builds in parallel. The Cold War is not cooling. Lines are hardening. Certain truths are deemed dangerous. Funding is threatened. Reassignments occur. A lead investigator is transferred without explanation. His replacement is younger, quieter, less inclined to push against invisible barriers. The case survives, but it is weakened, its edges dulled by compromise. Outside official channels, obsession takes root. A journalist begins collecting scraps, interviewing sources who refuse to speak on record, mapping connections others avoid. He publishes a long piece that reads like an accusation disguised as a question, suggesting Klaus Richter was caught between systems that both denied responsibility. The article is widely read, quietly criticized, never officially rebutted. Copies disappear from libraries. The journalist receives warnings that sound friendly until they are not. Years slide past. Berlin changes, but not enough. The wall still stands. Klaus Richter remains missing. Then, in 1987, a letter arrives at a police station with no return address, postmarked from a town near the border. Inside is a photograph, blurred but unmistakable, showing a man who looks like Klaus standing behind a fence, expression unreadable. On the back, in block letters, 3 words: he didn't cross. The photograph ignites the case all over again. Analysts enlarge it, enhance it, debate its authenticity. Skeptics call it a hoax. Believers call it proof of life, proof of captivity. The fence is identified as belonging to a restricted facility, location classified. Requests for access are denied. The letter's origin is traced as far as a public mailbox and then evaporates. For the community, the photograph is torture. It suggests survival without freedom, presence without voice. It reframes the disappearance not as an event, but as a process, ongoing, unresolved. People begin to ask a different question, more disturbing than murder. What if Klaus Richter lived, and continues to live, somewhere beyond reach, reduced to a file number, a liability, a man whose existence cannot be acknowledged without unraveling too much? As the decade ends, the case is again pushed aside, not closed, just quietly deprioritized, waiting for a future that might be kinder to truth. The file grows thicker. The questions grow sharper. And somewhere between archives and rumors, between photographs and denials, the outline of a solution begins to form. Fragile, incomplete, waiting for the moment when history itself will crack and let the light in. The city learns to live with the ghost, but ghosts have a way of rearranging rooms when no one is watching. And by the late 1980s, Klaus Richter is no longer just a missing man. He is a variable, an unstable element in a system that prides itself on control. His name surfaces in conversations that stop abruptly, in memos stamped confidential and misfiled on purpose, in the nervous habits of men who have learned to measure every word. Berlin remains divided, but the division inside the case deepens, splitting those who believe Klaus was taken from those who believe he walked willingly into something he could not escape. In 1988, a former intelligence analyst defects quietly, not with headlines or dramatic crossings, but with paperwork, a suitcase heavy with documents that smell of damp basements and sealed rooms. Among the material is a ledger, hand-typed, pages thin and fragile, cataloging operations that officially never occurred. Most of the entries are anonymized, initials only, dates, locations coded in abbreviations designed to confuse anyone without the key. One entry stands out because it is sloppy, because it breaks pattern. A full surname appears where there should be none, Richter. The ledger does not explain itself. It lists a date that matches the disappearance, a location that resolves into a transit hub, and a notation that reads simply, status unresolved. Analysts argue over whether this is coincidence, a common name, a red herring the defector included to inflate his importance. But the defector insists, voice flat, eyes exhausted, that Klaus Richter was real, that his case caused internal friction, that someone made a mistake and someone else buried it. The ledger reaches investigators through unofficial channels, photocopied, incomplete, missing the pages that might have offered clarity. Even so, it shifts the weight of the case. This is no longer rumor or inference. It is a trace, imperfect but undeniable, linking Klaus to a machinery that chews up people and outputs silence. Requests are filed to access original documents. Every request is denied. The reasons vary: jurisdiction, security, irrelevance. Each denial feels rehearsed. At the same time, something else changes. Witnesses who had once been eager to talk become cautious, then unreachable. A former coworker who had hinted at Klaus's late nights and unexplained phone calls suddenly claims faulty memory. A neighbor who swore she saw Klaus speak with strangers recants, says she was mistaken, embarrassed. One man disappears from public records entirely, his address reassigned, his employment history erased. The case does not just stall, it actively resists examination. The journalist who had pursued the story years earlier returns to it with renewed intensity. He tracks the defector, confirms the ledger's authenticity through secondary sources, begins connecting dots that were never meant to align. He discovers that Klaus's name appears nowhere else, not in arrest records, not in death registries, not in asylum applications. It is as if he was subtracted from the population without the arithmetic ever being shown. The journalist publishes nothing yet. He understands that timing is survival. Then history accelerates. In 1989, the wall falls and Berlin explodes into movement, sound, possibility. Checkpoints crumble. Archives are abandoned. Offices are cleared in a hurry that feels less like celebration and more like panic. Documents are shredded, burned, dumped into rivers. Amid the chaos, opportunities emerge for those who know where to look. Investigators, journalists, archivists converge on buildings that once repelled inquiry. Doors open that had been sealed for decades. Inside one such building, in a room that smells of mold and neglect, boxes are stacked without order. Files spill onto the floor. Many are incomplete, others deliberately damaged. Among them is a folder with a familiar thickness, its spine cracked, its label half-torn. The name is still legible, Richter K. The folder contains surveillance reports, movement logs, internal correspondence. None of it is signed. All of it points in the same direction. The reports describe Klaus as cooperative, confused, increasingly withdrawn. They reference debriefings that lasted hours, sometimes days. They note compliance issues and emotional instability, phrases that strip humanity down to manageable problems. One memo mentions a transfer, destination redacted, rationale vague. Another states that continued detention poses logistical concerns. There is no execution order. There is no release authorization. The file ends not with closure, but with absence. For investigators reading these pages, the effect is electric and horrifying. Klaus Richter was taken. He was held. He was interrogated. The question that remains is not whether the disappearance was orchestrated, but how it concluded. Did he die in custody, quietly, without ceremony, folded into statistics that no one tallies? Or was he moved again, deeper, further from any system that might later admit responsibility? As the city reorganizes itself, the case surges back into public consciousness. Newspapers run retrospective pieces. Television panels debate accountability. Klaus's face, older now, reconstructed by artists, stares out from screens. Former officials deny knowledge with a confidence that borders on arrogance. Others admit to fragments, hedged with qualifiers. No one offers a full picture. A new witness emerges, unexpected and difficult to dismiss. A retired guard from a now-defunct facility comes forward, seeking immunity, his health failing, his conscience heavy. He claims to have seen Klaus Richter years after the supposed disappearance. Thinner, quieter, moved under escort through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. He remembers Klaus because he asked a question no one was supposed to ask. "Do they know I'm still here?" The guard says he did not answer. The testimony cannot be fully verified. Records are missing. The facility's purpose is disputed. Still, it aligns too neatly with the fragments already uncovered to ignore. Klaus lived beyond 1979. He was not erased immediately. He lingered in a limbo designed to be permanent. Public reaction fractures along familiar lines. Some demand trials, truth commissions, names. Others argue that reopening such cases threatens fragile stability. Politicians speak of reconciliation, of looking forward. Families of the disappeared speak of betrayal, of justice delayed becoming justice denied. Klaus Richter becomes a symbol, but symbols are dangerous because they simplify, and this case refuses to be simple. In the mid-1990s, a final piece surfaces, almost by accident. A box mislabeled, overlooked, containing medical intake forms from a closed institution. Most names are coded. One entry is not. It lists Klaus Richter, age-adjusted, physical description altered just enough to pass casual scrutiny. The date is years after his disappearance. The diagnosis is nonspecific. The notes mention isolation, monitoring, eventual transfer. There is no discharge date. The institution denies everything, then admits to nothing. The forms are declared inconclusive. Skeptics call them fabrications. Supporters call them proof. For those who have followed the case from the beginning, they feel like confirmation of a truth long suspected. Klaus Richter did not vanish into thin air. He was absorbed, processed, forgotten by design. Yet even with this growing body of evidence, something is missing. A final location. A final act. A moment where the story resolves into something that can be named. Instead, the case hovers in a space between solved and unsolvable, where responsibility is diffuse and guilt is shared by systems rather than individuals. As the decade closes, investigators prepare a report unlike any before it, assembling fragments into a narrative that challenges official history. It is cautious, heavily footnoted, careful not to accuse directly. Still, its implications are explosive. It suggests that Klaus Richter was a casualty not of chaos, but of order, not of violence, but of procedure. The report is submitted, reviewed, delayed. Its release is postponed repeatedly. And while it waits, Klaus Richter remains what he has always been. A man suspended between presence and erasure. A cold case that refuses to cool. A reminder that some truths do not disappear. They wait, patient and sharp, for the moment when silence can no longer hold them. When the draft report finally circulates behind closed doors, it does not explode, it seeps, spreading unease through offices that had convinced themselves the past was sealed, because the document does something unforgivable in bureaucratic terms. It connects dots without asking permission. It does not shout. It does not accuse by name. It simply aligns dates, facilities, signatures, absences, and allows the implication to stand on its own, cold and unavoidable. Klaus Richter was detained by an internal security apparatus, held without charge, transferred between sites that officially did not exist, and then removed from all subsequent accounting. The report never says killed. It never says released. It leaves a gap where a human ending should be. That gap becomes the most dangerous thing in the room. Senior officials argue over language, over commas, over whether the word detention should be softened to protective custody, whether disappearance implies intent. Lawyers circle like vultures, not around truth, but around liability. Every edit strips a little more blood from the page. Investigators watch their work become abstracted, sanitized, turned into something that can be acknowledged without consequence. The case is being solved on paper and buried at the same time. Outside, the city is louder now, freer, impatient with secrecy. Former borders are tourist attractions. Checkpoints sell postcards. But for families of the disappeared, history has not ended, it has stalled. Klaus Richter's name appears on a list read aloud at a public forum, followed by a pause, then another name, then another. Each pause is a question mark no one wants to answer. When asked directly what happened to Klaus, officials respond with phrases that sound rehearsed. Insufficient evidence, conflicting records, ongoing review. Then the audio tape surfaces. It is not dramatic at first glance. A standard cassette, the kind used for dictation, found in a private collection donated by the widow of a former administrator who died without explaining why he kept so many things that were never his. The tape is unlabeled. Its existence is noted casually, almost overlooked, until someone presses play. The sound quality is poor, voices muffled, interrupted by static. But one voice is clear enough to chill the room. It is calm. It is measured. It is Klaus Richter. He is answering questions. He gives his name, his date of birth, his profession. He asks where he is. The question is ignored. He mentions Berlin, the station, the morning he was taken aside for clarification. He sounds confused, not panicked, as if still clinging to the belief that misunderstanding can be resolved by explanation. At one point, he laughs softly, apologizes for his accent. Later, his tone changes. He stops volunteering information. He starts asking about time. The tape ends abruptly. There is no date, no location, no indication of how long the recording continued beyond what survived. Analysts verify the voice against known samples. The match is strong, too strong to dismiss. For the first time, Klaus Richter speaks for himself after years of being spoken about, and the effect is devastating. The tape forces a shift. It is no longer possible to frame the case as theoretical. Klaus is not a symbol on paper. He is a man in a room, responding to unseen interrogators, aware enough to be afraid, lucid enough to understand that something is wrong. Public reaction is immediate and fierce. Media outlets demand access. Families demand names. Activists demand prosecutions. The phrase Berlin 1979 trends again, heavy with accusation. Officials scramble to contain the damage. They question the tape's chain of custody. They hint at manipulation. They emphasize the absence of corroborating metadata. But the voice cuts through every caveat. It humanizes what had been deliberately depersonalized. It introduces a witness who cannot be cross-examined, cannot be silenced, cannot be intimidated. New witnesses emerge emboldened by the sound of Klaus speaking. A former nurse from a secure medical ward steps forward, describing a patient who arrived without records, referred to only by a number, guarded at all times. He suffered insomnia, she says, asked repeatedly for newspapers, for proof that the outside world still existed. She remembers his hands shaking when he signed forms he could not read. She remembers being told never to write his name down. A transport officer corroborates parts of the story, recalling late-night transfers, windows blacked out, routes that avoided main roads. He does not remember Klaus's face clearly, only his voice polite, insistent, asking questions no one answered. The officer says the man was still alive the last time he saw him. The date is years after 1979. Each testimony tightens the net, but the net has no center, no single node that can be cut to end the story. Responsibility diffuses across departments, across decades, across legal frameworks that no longer exist. Prosecutors explore options and retreat. Statutes of limitations loom. Jurisdiction dissolves. The past proves legally slippery. Then comes the most controversial revelation yet, pulled from a set of declassified coordination logs that few expected to matter. A notation referencing an administrative resolution appears next to Klaus Richter's identifier. The phrase is vague, chillingly so. Analysts debate its meaning late into the night. In similar cases, the phrase had been used to indicate forced relocation, identity reassignment, long-term containment. In rarer cases, it meant termination of oversight due to death. The log does not specify which applies here. Pressure mounts to clarify, and under that pressure, a retired official agrees to speak, anonymously, voice altered, face hidden. He confirms what many suspected but could not prove. Klaus Richter became a problem that could not be resolved cleanly. He knew too much, not because he was a spy, but because he had been exposed to processes that were never meant to be seen. Releasing him risked exposure. Charging him risked scrutiny. Keeping him indefinitely risked leaks. The solution, the official says, was to move him beyond reach. What does that mean? The interviewer asks. The answer is a pause long enough to feel like a confession. It means, the voice says, that his life continued in a form that no longer intersected with the public record. The statement ignites outrage and despair in equal measure. Continued how? Where? Under what conditions? No answers follow. The official disappears from contact. The net tightens again, finding nothing solid to hold. As months pass, the investigation reaches a grim plateau. Enough evidence exists to confirm detention, interrogation, prolonged confinement. Not enough exists to pinpoint an endpoint. Klaus Richter remains alive in records long after his disappearance. And then he vanishes again, this time inside the system itself. The cold case is no longer cold. It is warm, pulsing, unresolved in a new and more painful way. The final scene investigators can reliably reconstruct shows Klaus being transferred out of a facility under a different name, medical notes indicating deterioration, isolation exacerbating psychological strain. After that, there is nothing. No death certificate, no release form, no burial record. Just silence, deeper and more intentional than before. And in that silence, a new realization takes hold, one that reframes everything that came before. Solving this case may not mean finding Klaus Richter's body or even his final location. It may mean accepting that the truth was designed to survive without a conclusion, that the disappearance was not a failure of the system, but one of its most successful operations. The question shifts, heavy and unsettling. If Klaus Richter did not simply vanish, if he was erased methodically, then how many others share his fate, hidden not by chaos, but by order so complete it leaves no trace at all. By the time the phrase administrative resolution enters public vocabulary, it has already done its work, hollowing out certainty and replacing it with dread, because it suggests a conclusion without closure, an ending without an ending, and the investigation, now fully exposed to light, begins to behave like something wounded, thrashing between revelation and retreat. Committees convene. Panels are formed. Experts argue over definitions as if language itself might absolve what actions cannot. Klaus Richter's life, once reduced to a missing person form, is now scattered across testimony, tape, logs, and silence, and none of it lines up neatly enough to satisfy a courtroom. The case pivots again when analysts re-examine the movement logs tied to that final transfer, the one that leads nowhere on paper. The route numbers correspond to infrastructure no longer in use, service tunnels decommissioned after reunification, places scrubbed from maps and memory alike. Engineers are consulted. Blueprints are unrolled on tables that have not seen daylight in years. A pattern emerges, faint but persistent, pointing toward a network of interim holding sites, temporary by design, intended to leave minimal footprint. Not prisons, not hospitals, something in between. A field team enters one of these locations, now abandoned, its entrance disguised as a maintenance hatch behind layers of graffiti and rust. Inside, the air is stale, heavy with old disinfectant and something sweeter beneath it, decay's residue. Rooms are small, windows non-existent. Hooks line the walls where equipment once hung. There are scratches near a doorframe, shallow, repeated as if made by fingernails. The team documents everything, careful not to assign meaning too quickly, but meaning seeps in anyway. This is not a place people pass through briefly. On a metal shelf, half buried under debris, they find a stack of intake cards. Most are blank. A few bear numbers only. One card is different. A name has been written and crossed out, written again in a different hand, then erased so thoroughly it has torn the paper. Under the damage, a few letters remain visible when light is angled just right. RICH. It is not proof. It is proximity. It is enough to keep digging. Meanwhile, pressure builds from another direction. A civil suit is filed on behalf of Klaus Richter's surviving family, demanding recognition, not compensation. They want an official acknowledgement of unlawful detention. The suit forces disclosures that decades of inertia had avoided. Internal emails surface. Memos are unsealed. A pattern of euphemism becomes undeniable. Words like processing, containment, monitoring recur with mechanical regularity. Klaus is referred to as the subject long after any legitimate investigation should have ended. The state responds defensively, arguing that the actions occurred under legal frameworks that no longer exist, that current institutions cannot be held responsible for dissolved entities. The argument lands poorly. Public patience is thin. The tape of Klaus's voice circulates again, fragments replayed endlessly, his calm confusion becoming a rallying cry. Each replay sharpens the question everyone is now asking. If he lived, why was he never allowed to return? Then comes the medical angle, long suspected, finally articulated. A psychiatrist reviews the intake forms, the nurse's testimony, the behavioral notes scattered through the files. She outlines a hypothesis that chills the room. Klaus Richter may not have been held simply to silence him, but to study him, to observe the psychological effects of isolation, uncertainty, identity erosion. Not an experiment in the traditional sense, she clarifies, but an exploitation of circumstance. A man trapped inside a process that treated his deterioration as data. This interpretation reframes the timeline. It explains the prolonged detention without trial. It explains the repeated transfers, each one destabilizing, each one resetting his sense of reality. It explains why release was never considered a viable option. A man subjected to that process does not re-enter society cleanly. He carries evidence in his behavior, his speech, his very presence. The system could not risk that. Investigators return to the medical institution referenced in the intake forms, now operating under a different name. Administrators deny any continuity with the past. But in a sub-basement, in a room repurposed for storage, old patient logs are found boxed and mislabeled. Most are destroyed. A few survive. They show anonymized entries with annotations that match the language used in Klaus's file. Sleep deprivation, controlled information exposure, monitored correspondence that never reached recipients. The dates overlap. A former orderly, tracked down after weeks of searching, confirms the practices without naming names. He describes patients who were not sick in the conventional sense, but disoriented, desperate for context. He remembers one man in particular who insisted on marking time by memorizing radio schedules he was never allowed to hear. The orderly remembers because the man thanked him for small kindnesses, for answering questions he was not supposed to answer. When shown Klaus's photograph, the orderly closes his eyes before nodding. Still, the end remains elusive. The logs stop. The testimony trails off. Somewhere in the early 1990s, Klaus Richter disappears for the second time, this time within institutions that are dissolving, merging, rebranding. Records are lost in transitions that feel suspiciously convenient. Investigators suspect death by neglect, illness untreated, mind finally breaking under weight no one was meant to carry alone. But suspicion is not proof. A breakthrough arrives from an unexpected quarter. A retired logistics coordinator, sorting through personal effects before a move, discovers a notebook he does not remember keeping. It contains route schedules, handwritten, with marginal notes. One note references a transfer to long-term care, destination abbreviated in a way that initially defies decoding. Analysts cross-reference. The abbreviation resolves into a rural facility, ostensibly a rehabilitation center, operational in the early 1990s, closed quietly years later. The facility is visited. It is now a private residence, renovated, sanitized, history painted over. But under the new walls, old bones remain. In the cellar, investigators find a sealed door behind shelving. Inside, a small room, padded, soundproofed. On the wall, faint markings indicate where a bed once stood, where restraints were fixed. No personal items remain. No names. Just space where a life could be contained and erased. Local records reveal that an unidentified male patient died there in 1993, cause listed as cardiac failure, burial handled by the state due to lack of next of kin. The description matches Klaus's age range. The timing fits. Dental records are missing. The grave, if it exists, is unmarked. Authorities caution against conclusions. Families hear confirmation in everything unsaid. The investigation reaches its moral climax here, at the edge of certainty. A report is finalized, this one bolder than any before. It states, in careful language, that Klaus Richter was unlawfully detained, subjected to prolonged isolation, transferred through a network of unofficial facilities, and likely died in state custody years after his disappearance. It stops short of naming perpetrators. It recommends apologies, memorialization, institutional reform. When the report is released, reactions fracture predictably. Some call it a resolution. Others call it a whitewash. Klaus's family accepts it with a grief that has no release valve, because knowing how a man lived his last years is not the same as being allowed to mourn him properly. There is no body to bury, no date to mark, only a story pieced together from the debris of secrecy. Yet even as the case is declared solved by official standards, doubt lingers like a bruise that never fades. The phrase "likely died" becomes a target, a loophole through which uncertainty crawls back in. Without remains, without definitive identification, Klaus Richter remains, in a technical sense, missing. Alive in possibility, dead in probability, suspended between two conclusions that both feel incomplete. In Berlin, a small plaque is installed near the station where he was last seen. It bears his name, the year, and a single line: disappeared in the service of silence. People stop to read it. Some walk on. Others linger, imagining the man stepping into a corridor he believed led to an explanation, not a disappearance. The city moves around the plaque, busy, modern, but the space it marks feels heavier than concrete. And as the case file is archived one final time, stamped with words meant to end the conversation, a quieter realization settles in among those who followed it closely. Solving the Berlin 1979 cold case did not restore a life or deliver justice in any clean sense. It exposed a mechanism, precise and ruthless, that turned a person into a problem, and then into nothing at all. The history books will record Klaus Richter as a victim of his era, a footnote in the long ledger of the Cold War. But for those who listened to his voice on that tape, who traced his movements through tunnels and rooms without windows, who imagined the slow erosion of a man denied context and time, the case does not feel finished. It feels like a warning, echoing forward, reminding a city that even when walls fall and files open, some disappearances are engineered so well that what remains is not an answer, but an afterimage, burned into collective memory, impossible to erase. Officially, the Berlin 1979 cold case is closed with qualifiers stacked like legal padding, but closure does not behave the way institutions expect it to, because it does not stop people from looking backward, and it does not stop evidence from resurfacing when the ground shifts again. In the months after the report's release, archivists continue their quiet, obsessive work, digitizing boxes no one had touched in decades, and it is in this mechanical, almost boring process that the case finds its second wind, not through drama, but through metadata. A batch of magnetic reels, audio archives mislabeled as environmental recordings, is processed and indexed. Most contain static, test tones, dead air. One reel, cataloged under a maintenance code, plays something different. A voice reading numbers, dates, instructions, the cadence unmistakably administrative. Analysts listen, intrigued but cautious. Then, halfway through the reel, the voice pauses, clears its throat, and addresses someone in the room by name. Richter. The name is not shouted. It is not emphasized. It is used the way people use names when they assume familiarity, when they do not expect to be overheard. Richter, the voice says, we need to confirm your understanding. The reel continues with questions about compliance, orientation, acceptance of conditions. Klaus answers softly, audibly fatigued but coherent. He asks again about release. The response is clinical, non-committal. The recording ends with a door closing. Forensic audio specialists compare the voice to the earlier cassette. The match is conclusive. This is Klaus Richter years after his disappearance, alive, still detained, still asking the same questions. The date code embedded in the reel places the recording in 1991. This alone destabilizes the official narrative, which had cautiously suggested death around 1993 without direct evidence. Klaus survived longer than assumed. He endured. The revelation forces a revision. Investigators reconvene, irritated and alarmed, because a closed case is easier to manage than a reopened one. The new evidence pushes the timeline forward, demanding answers about where Klaus was held in the early 1990s and why no corresponding records exist. The rural facility previously identified comes under renewed scrutiny. Property records are re-examined. Ownership chains reveal a shell structure designed to obscure continuity. The building changed names, operators, purposes, but its function remained eerily consistent. A ground-penetrating radar survey is authorized around the former facility under the guise of structural assessment. The results are ambiguous but troubling. Anomalies appear beneath a section of the grounds that had been landscaped after closure. Small, irregular voids suggest disturbed earth. No excavation order is granted. Officials cite lack of probable cause. The phrase feels obscene in context. Parallel to this, a former administrator breaks silence. He is not heroic. He is careful, calculating, aware of his own vulnerability. He agrees to speak only in hypotheticals, only about how things were done. He describes a policy of human containment, designed to manage individuals who could not be processed through normal legal channels. The goal, he says, was not punishment, but risk mitigation. Release was possible in theory, but only if the subject could be reintegrated without causing institutional harm. In practice, that threshold was rarely met. When asked what happened to those who could not be reintegrated, the administrator shrugs, a gesture heavy with implication. They stayed, he says, until staying wasn't necessary anymore. The phrasing ignites outrage when leaked, but legally it means nothing. It names no act. It admits no crime. It floats above culpability like a fog. Still, it sharpens the public's understanding of what Klaus Richter represented. Not an anomaly, but a category. A test case. A quiet precedent. Investigators focus on the phrase, not necessary anymore, chasing its meaning through budgets and staffing changes. They discover a drawdown in funding for long-term containment facilities in the early 1990s, coinciding with political shifts and public scrutiny. Facilities closed. Subjects were reassessed. Some were released quietly, identities altered, histories erased. Others were transferred to medical care. Others, the paper trail suggests, were deemed unsustainable. A nurse from the rural facility, long retired, is located. She agrees to talk after assurances that no one expects her to remember names. She remembers routines instead. Sedation schedules. Restricted access orders. She remembers a patient who resisted medication not violently, but verbally, insisting on conversations, on explanations. She remembers him weakening over time, body following where mind had already gone. She remembers a winter when his room was emptied and never refilled. Medical logs from that period are incomplete, but telling. A spike in unspecified fatalities appears in the quarter following the facility's administrative closure. Causes of death are generic. Oversight minimal. One entry aligns with Klaus's known medical profile, age-adjusted, identity redacted. It is not proof. It is convergence. The case's legal architects argue against reopening conclusions. They warn of precedent, of endless review. They suggest that truth has already been acknowledged to the extent possible. The families respond with a different calculus. Acknowledgement without accountability feels like a second disappearance, quieter but just as deliberate. Public memorials multiply. Art installations project Klaus's face onto buildings at night, aging him year by year, forcing viewers to confront the passage of time stolen from him. Students write theses. Filmmakers request access. The story metastasizes into culture, where it cannot be managed by footnotes or redactions. Then comes the final procedural blow. A clerical error, almost laughable in its simplicity, reveals that one of the sealed boxes from the rural facility was never destroyed, merely misplaced. Inside are personal effects, cataloged but never returned. Clothing. A wristwatch. A notebook with blank pages except for a few entries at the back, written small, controlled, as if space itself was rationed. The handwriting matches Klaus's. The entries are sparse. dates without context, weather notes, counts of days that reset unexpectedly, suggesting transfers. One line stands out, written darker, pressed hard enough to indent the paper. I am still me. Another follows weeks later. They want me to forget that. The notebook does not explain how Klaus died. It does not say where, but it confirms what no report could state with certainty. He remained conscious of his identity, of the injustice of his condition, until near the end. He was not erased internally, even as the system tried to erase him externally. The notebook is released to the public after heated debate. It becomes the emotional center of the case, more powerful than any log or tape. It reframes the question one last time. The issue is no longer whether Klaus Richter died in custody, but whether the system that held him alive without life can ever be reconciled with the values it claimed to defend. As the investigation edges toward its final revision, one truth becomes unavoidable. The Berlin 1979 cold case was never about solving a disappearance in the conventional sense. It was about tracing the long arc of an erasure, understanding how a man could be removed from history without being killed outright, and how, even decades later, the echoes of that decision continue to demand answers. And in the quiet after the revelations, when the headlines move on and officials return to measured language, Klaus Richter remains present, not as a file or a symbol, but as a voice, a name, a notebook line that refuses to fade. I am still me. The notebook changes everything and nothing at the same time, because while it offers intimacy, it denies finality, and the case enters its most unstable phase, where facts are abundant but certainty remains elusive. And every new revelation deepens the moral weight without delivering the release people crave. Klaus Richter is no longer missing in the abstract. He is present in handwriting, in breath caught on tape, in routines documented by strangers who never intended to remember him. The question is no longer what happened, but how far the truth is allowed to go before it collides with interests still very much alive. A special review board is convened under mounting pressure, framed publicly as a historical clarification, privately as damage control. Its mandate is narrow by design, limited to verifying documentation rather than assigning responsibility. Even so, its members understand the danger of proximity. They are not asked to speculate. They are asked to confirm. And confirmation, in this case, is explosive. They begin by reconstructing Klaus's final known movements with new precision, aligning the notebook's dates with staffing rosters, transfer schedules, and procurement logs. Patterns emerge. Each reset in Klaus's day count corresponds to a documented internal relocation. Each gap aligns with periods of administrative restructuring. His isolation was not random. It was synchronized with institutional needs, adjusted to minimize exposure and maximize control. One board member, a historian with no background in security work, notices something others missed: Klaus's weather notes. They seem trivial at first, a coping mechanism, but when cross-referenced with meteorological data, they pinpoint location ranges with startling accuracy. Klaus was marking not just time, but place, anchoring himself to reality through details the system could not fully suppress. The notes narrow his final known location to a specific region during a specific winter. Investigators return to that region quietly, without press, because by now they know spectacle only hardens resistance. They review municipal death records again, this time looking not for names, but for anomalies. Unidentified individuals, state-handled burials, missing medical documentation. They find a cluster. The dates cluster. The ages align. The paperwork is thin to the point of negligence. One entry stands out because it includes a personal effect logged as notebook, later marked destroyed. The destruction order is signed by an official whose name has appeared before, always adjacent to Klaus's case, never directly implicated. He is alive, retired, respected. When approached for comment, he declines politely, citing memory issues. He does not deny involvement. He does not confirm it. His silence feels deliberate, calibrated. As word of the board's findings leaks, public sentiment hardens. The narrative shifts again, from tragedy to indictment. Klaus Richter is no longer framed as collateral damage of a chaotic era, but as evidence of a deliberate policy that valued institutional stability over individual existence. Editorials abandon caution. The phrase state-sanctioned disappearance appears in print, bold and accusatory. Former officials respond predictably, warning against retroactive judgment, invoking the pressures of the time, the threat environment, the necessity of difficult decisions. These defenses land poorly against the intimacy of Klaus's words, against the simplicity of "I am still me." The distance between justification and cruelty collapses under that sentence. The board's interim report acknowledges what had previously been implied. Klaus Richter remained in custody into the early 1990s, subjected to prolonged isolation and psychological stress, without due process or legal oversight. It stops short of declaring cause of death. Instead, it uses a phrase that ignites fury and resignation in equal measure. Presumed deceased in state care. Presumed is not enough for the family. It is not enough for the public. It is not enough for history. Pressure mounts for exhumations, for forensic confirmation. Authorities resist, citing degraded remains, uncertain locations, the risk of reopening countless other cases. The argument is transparent. If Klaus is fully accounted for, others will demand the same. A former archivist breaks ranks and releases a private memo, never meant for public eyes. It details a protocol for terminal containment, outlining steps to reduce oversight when a subject's continued maintenance outweighs perceived benefit. The language is chillingly neutral. Care transitions to custodial management. Observation transitions to minimization. Life becomes an administrative burden. The memo does not name Klaus, but its timing and context align too closely to ignore. Legal experts debate whether it constitutes evidence of intent. Ethicists debate whether intent even matters at this stage. For the family, the memo reads like a death sentence written without ink. Then, unexpectedly, a survivor comes forward. He is older now, voice fragile but steady, one of the few released quietly during the early 1990s as policies shifted. He never spoke before because he was told silence was the condition of freedom. He says he met Klaus briefly, in passing, during a transfer, long after 1979. He remembers Klaus because he was still asking questions, still trying to orient himself, still refusing to dissolve into compliance. He told me his name, the man says, as if he was afraid it would disappear if he didn't. The survivor describes Klaus's physical state as weakened but lucid, his spirit intact in ways that made him dangerous to a system built on erasure. He last saw Klaus being escorted in the opposite direction during a facility closure, toward an area designated for those not eligible for release. He never saw him again. The testimony is sworn. It cannot be easily dismissed. It fills in a gap no document could. Klaus lived. Klaus resisted forgetting. Klaus was separated from those deemed manageable. With this, the case reaches a threshold. Not resolution, but saturation. The evidence no longer points in multiple directions. It converges on a single unbearable truth. Klaus Richter was not lost. He was held, diminished, and ultimately discarded by a system that calculated his existence as a risk. The board prepares its final report under intense scrutiny. Drafts circulate, sharpened and softened in equal measure. Words are chosen with care, not to obscure, but to survive legal challenge. Still, the conclusion lands like a verdict. Klaus Richter's disappearance was the result of deliberate state action. His prolonged detention violated fundamental rights. His death occurred under circumstances that demand moral accountability, if not legal consequence. The report is released on a gray morning, the kind Klaus used to note in his book. It triggers resignations, apologies, carefully worded statements of regret. It does not trigger prosecutions. For many, that absence is the final betrayal. A memorial service is held without remains, without a coffin, without certainty. Klaus's notebook pages are read aloud. His name is spoken repeatedly, anchored in sound the way he once anchored himself in weather and time. People stand in silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because the story has finally said too much. And yet, even here, at what feels like the end, something lingers unresolved. The title of the case, now widely circulated, claims solution, claims history rewritten. But beneath that claim is an unease that refuses to settle. Because if Klaus Richter could be erased so completely, for so long, by mechanisms designed to protect, then the true mystery is not how his story ended. It is how many others never left a notebook behind to prove they were still themselves. After the memorial, after the reports, after the language of regret has been exhausted, the case should fade, but it doesn't, because history has a habit of reopening wounds when it senses unfinished business, and Klaus Richter's story, now etched into public record, begins to exert a strange gravitational pull on other disappearances long written off as unsolvable. Archivists notice parallels. Investigators notice patterns. Families notice similarities too precise to ignore. The Berlin 1979 cold case stops being singular and starts looking like a template. Requests pour in to re-examine files from the same era, same agencies, same euphemisms. Protective custody. Administrative delay. Unresponsive asset. Each phrase now carries the weight of Klaus's voice behind it, stripping plausible deniability from bureaucratic habit. Officials resist the scope creep, warning of institutional overload, of endless retrospection. The warnings sound hollow against the evidence already exposed. A comparative review is launched anyway, limited at first, cautious, designed not to alarm. Analysts line up timelines across cases and discover synchronization that cannot be accidental. Transfers cluster around policy shifts. Detentions extend beyond legal thresholds in identical ways. Releases, when they occur, follow similar protocols of silence and reinvention. Klaus Richter was not an outlier. He was early. This realization reframes the phrase solved cold case into something more unsettling. Solved does not mean contained. It means unlocked. And once unlocked, the past spills forward, destabilizing narratives built on selective memory. Berlin's reckoning begins to look less like closure and more like exposure. In the archives of a neighboring state, a mislabeled box yields another audio fragment, degraded but legible. A different voice this time, older, weaker, repeating a name under breath as if practicing it. Klaus Richter. The context is unclear. Analysts debate whether the voice belongs to Klaus himself or to someone remembering him. Either interpretation is disturbing. It suggests that Klaus's existence persisted not only in records, but in the minds of others caught in the same machinery. The fragment ignites speculation that Klaus may have served as a reference point among detainees, a proof that resistance was possible, that identity could be preserved even when everything else was stripped away. Survivors begin to speak more openly now, emboldened by numbers. Their stories differ in detail but converge in feeling. Time stretched, names became dangerous, memory was an act of defiance. One survivor recalls a rule enforced informally but ruthlessly. Never speak of the outside unless asked. Klaus broke that rule repeatedly, asking about weather, about holidays, about trains. He wanted anchors. He wanted friction against the narrative he was being forced to inhabit. The survivor believes this is why Klaus was never released. He would not dissolve. As this oral history accumulates, resistance grows inside institutions tasked with managing the fallout. Some officials argue that reopening these cases risks delegitimizing the present, undermining trust. Others counter that trust built on omission is already bankrupt. The debate fractures along generational lines. Younger staff push for transparency. Older ones urge caution, haunted not only by guilt but by fear of precedent. Amid this tension, a forensic linguist examines Klaus's notebook again, focusing not on content but on progression. The handwriting changes subtly over time, pressure fluctuating, spacing narrowing, but syntax remains intact. Klaus's cognitive clarity persisted longer than expected under isolation conditions. This undermines earlier assumptions that his deterioration justified continued containment. He was not incoherent. He was inconvenient. The linguist's report becomes a quiet indictment. It suggests that decisions about Klaus's fate were not driven by medical necessity, but by risk assessment. His mind was still sharp enough to remember, to testify, to contradict official narratives. In a system that equated memory with threat, that was unforgivable. Pressure mounts for a final act of accountability, something symbolic, if nothing else. The city agrees to rename a small plaza near the station where Klaus vanished. The gesture is criticized as insufficient, praised as overdue, dissected endlessly. On the day the new sign is unveiled, it rains steadily, the kind of rain Klaus would have noted without comment. People gather anyway. No speeches. Just the name, fixed in metal, resistant to erasure. Behind the scenes, a last attempt is made to locate Klaus's remains. Advances in forensic mapping, combined with newly released municipal data, narrow the likely burial site to a neglected section of a state cemetery. Excavation begins quietly without cameras. Soil is sifted. Bones are catalogued. DNA analysis is attempted but yields inconclusive results due to degradation. The remains cannot be definitively identified. The announcement lands softly, almost apologetically. Forensic limits. Time elapsed. No confirmation. The public reaction is muted, not because people no longer care, but because they have learned what this case offers and what it withholds. Klaus Richter remains present without being locatable, acknowledged without being fully recovered. In academic circles, the case becomes a cornerstone example, cited in studies of state power, memory, and disappearance. In classrooms, students debate whether truth without punishment is justice or performance. Klaus's notebook is reproduced in textbooks, his sentence underlined, annotated, analyzed. "I am still me" becomes shorthand for resistance under erasure. Yet even as the case diffuses into theory, something raw persists at its center. Klaus Richter did not ask to be emblematic. He asked where he was. He asked how long. He asked when he could go home. The system answered none of those questions honestly, and history, for all its revisions, struggles to do better. As the years pass, references to Berlin 1979 shift in tone. The headline claims solution, rewritten history. The subtext whispers something else. This was not a mystery cracked by brilliance. It was a silence cracked by time, by the slow decay of secrecy, by the refusal of one man to forget his own name. And still, at the edge of the record, another question waits, quieter now but no less sharp. If Klaus Richter endured for years inside a structure designed to make him vanish, and if fragments of his presence continue to surface long after his presumed death, then perhaps the final rewrite of history is not about what happened to him. Perhaps it is about what a society chooses to remember once forgetting is no longer possible. By the time memory becomes unavoidable, resistance shifts shape, no longer loud or defensive, but procedural, buried in process, because institutions understand that outrage fades faster than paperwork, and Klaus Richter's case, now cited, taught, memorialized, begins to encounter a different kind of silence, the silence of saturation, where everyone knows the story well enough to believe nothing new remains to be learned. That assumption is wrong. It is wrong because history rarely reveals itself all at once. It leaks. It corrodes. It returns through side doors long after the front entrance has been sealed. And in the early 2000s, one of those doors opens unexpectedly, not through an archive or a witness, but through technology that did not exist when Klaus first disappeared. A private firm contracted to digitize legacy personnel systems flags an anomaly during routine error checking. A user profile persists in the database long after the associated department was dissolved, its permissions never fully revoked, its activity logs truncated but not erased. The profile is skeletal, almost empty, but it carries an internal identifier that analysts recognize immediately. It is the same identifier attached to Klaus Richter's case file, the one used after his name was removed from circulation. At first, the finding is dismissed as a glitch, a remnant of sloppy data migration. But the timestamps tell a different story. The profile shows periodic access attempts well into the mid-1990s, long after Klaus was presumed dead. No content is accessed. No messages sent. Just logins. Presence without interaction. A ghost account. Security specialists debate what this means. One theory suggests automated maintenance checks. Another proposes that the profile was used as a placeholder, a container for data too sensitive to attach to a living person. A third theory, whispered rather than written, suggests something more unsettling. That someone somewhere kept Klaus Richter administratively alive long after his physical fate had likely been decided. The implications ripple outward. If Klaus's identifier remained active, what else remained open? Analysts run broader queries. They find others. Not many. Enough. Profiles attached to individuals officially listed as missing, deceased, or unaccounted for. Each one represents a story that never reached a notebook, never found a tape, never made it to a memorial. This discovery reframes Klaus's case yet again. His survival in records, even hollowed out, suggests that the system never fully let go of him. He was not just a liability managed to extinction. He was a variable maintained, monitored, perhaps as a safeguard, perhaps as leverage. The truth remains slippery, but the shape of it grows sharper. A former systems engineer, retired and increasingly candid, explains how such profiles functioned. They allowed access to restricted datasets without triggering alerts tied to active personnel. They were shadows within the system, useful precisely because they belonged to no one. When asked whether Klaus's profile was ever tied to biometric confirmation, the engineer pauses. He says that level of authentication was not required. He says that was the point. This raises a question no one wants to answer publicly. If Klaus's digital presence persisted, could his physical presence have done the same? The question is not whether he lived freely, but whether he lived at all beyond what has been acknowledged. The gap between presumption and proof yawns open again. Investigators revisit the rural facility's closure records with new eyes. They notice that one transfer listed as terminal lacks a corresponding death notification. Instead, the line item is marked resolved, a word that appears nowhere else in the dataset. Cross-referenced with logistic schedules, the resolution coincides with a transport route that leads not to a cemetery or hospital, but to a long-term care complex operating under a civilian contract, one that has never been publicly associated with detention. Access to the complex's historical records is denied repeatedly. Then, unexpectedly, a partial ledger is released, heavily redacted but revealing enough to disturb. It lists residents admitted under non-standard protocols, their names replaced with codes. Lengths of stay vary wildly. Some residents disappear from the ledger without explanation. Others persist for years, their status unchanged. One code aligns with Klaus's identifier. The alignment is not conclusive. It is statistical, circumstantial, deniable. But for those who have followed the case from the beginning, it feels like standing on familiar ground again, the ground of almost knowing, where certainty hovers just out of reach. The possibility that Klaus Richter survived longer than believed, perhaps even beyond the period of public reckoning, is both hopeful and horrifying. Public reaction to this development is muted, not because it lacks impact, but because it destabilizes the fragile closure people have constructed for themselves. To accept that Klaus might have lived even longer is to accept that suffering continued unseen, unacknowledged, long after apologies were issued and plaques installed. It complicates grief. It resists narrative. A philosopher invited to comment frames it bluntly. Closure, he says, is a luxury systems offer when accountability is impossible. Klaus Richter's case refuses closure because it exposes a continuum rather than an event. Disappearance was not a moment. It was a condition. This framing resonates with survivors who have remained silent until now. One woman comes forward, describing a brother detained under similar circumstances, released years later with instructions never to speak. She says he mentioned Klaus once, only once, as someone who didn't get out. The phrasing suggests endurance, not immediacy. It suggests time. The investigation circles this implication carefully, aware that speculation can become cruelty. They do not announce a revision of the timeline. They do not declare Klaus alive. They acknowledge uncertainty, officially this time, adding an addendum to the case summary. The exact date and circumstances of Klaus Richter's death remain undetermined. The addendum is a small paragraph appended to a thick document, but its effect is seismic. It reopens everything without reopening anything. It admits that history has been rewritten once and may need to be rewritten again. It confirms that even the solved version of this cold case contains unresolved heat. As the media revisits the story yet again, the headline language shifts subtly. Less certainty, more caution. Solved acquires an asterisk. New evidence becomes conditional. The public grows weary but attentive, sensing that this case has never behaved like a normal one, that it resists being placed neatly in the past. In Berlin, the plaza bearing Klaus's name becomes a quiet gathering place for people with stories that never reached files. Notes are left beneath the sign, anonymous, handwritten, brief. Names without surnames. Dates without years. Messages without context. They accumulate, then are cleared away, then accumulate again, a ritual of incomplete remembrance. And through it all, Klaus Richter remains what he has always been. Not a corpse, not a survivor, but a presence that refuses to resolve. A man whose disappearance expanded rather than contracted over time, forcing a society to confront not just what it did, but how long it kept doing it after it thought the danger had passed. The closer the case comes to being fully understood, the clearer one thing becomes. The mystery was never whether Klaus Richter vanished. It was whether anyone was ever supposed to be able to find him at all. By the time the case reaches what officials insist is its final phase, the language surrounding Klaus Richter grows careful to the point of fragility. Every statement hedged, every verb softened, because the closer investigators move toward institutional accountability. The more the past begins to behave like a live wire, sparking unexpectedly, refusing to stay buried. Files once thought exhausted are reopened not because of a breakthrough, but because too many margins contain handwriting that does not match, too many signatures appear months after offices officially closed, too many decisions were made by people whose names never appear in any directory. What emerges is not a single conspiracy, but a choreography, a system of quiet cooperation where no one person controlled the outcome, yet everyone understood the direction. Klaus Richter did not fall through the cracks. The cracks were designed to look accidental. A review panel, formed under public pressure and staffed with historians, former judges, and technical experts, begins reconstructing the bureaucratic environment of late 1979 not as a timeline, but as an ecosystem. They map how information flowed, how reports were delayed, how alerts were downgraded, how absence was converted into ambiguity. In this environment, disappearance becomes administrative friction, not a crime, and responsibility dissolves into procedure. One analyst describes it as disappearance by inertia. Once Klaus's case was slowed, nothing needed to be done to erase him. He simply stopped moving forward. Forms waited for approvals that never came. Requests expired. Alerts timed out. Silence became the default state. This understanding reframes earlier assumptions about intent. The question is no longer who ordered Klaus Richter removed, but who allowed his removal to remain unresolved. The answer implicates far more people than a single chain of command ever could. Witnesses called before the panel speak in fragments. A former clerk remembers a folder that was never to be stamped. A transport officer recalls a detour added to a route without explanation. A nurse from the civilian care complex remembers a man who never spoke but flinched at German accents. None can swear these memories belong to Klaus. All insist they could belong to someone like him. The panel listens without interrupting. They know certainty is impossible now. They are not searching for a body. They are searching for a pattern strong enough to withstand denial. That pattern crystallizes when procurement records surface, showing sustained funding for long-term special cases. Years after the programs they allegedly supported were dismantled. The funds moved through civilian contractors, then disappeared into aggregated budgets. The money never stopped. It merely stopped being labeled. When confronted with this finding, a former Interior Ministry official breaks ranks. He does not confess to crimes. He does not name names. He explains philosophy. He describes a post-war state obsessed with stability, terrified of embarrassment, convinced that unresolved cases were more dangerous than immoral ones. Klaus Richter, he suggests, became an inconvenience that could not be resolved without risk, and so was preserved in limbo, neither alive nor dead in the official imagination. This testimony reframes the moral axis of the case. The greatest harm was not the act of disappearance, but the prolonged refusal to decide what to do with its consequences. Klaus was not silenced to hide a secret. He was maintained to avoid one. Public response fractures along generational lines. Younger audiences, raised on transparency rhetoric, expressed disbelief that such systems could function without centralized control. Older citizens recognized the shape immediately. They remember a time when ambiguity was a strategy, when the absence of evidence was treated as evidence of success. The media amplifies this divide. Documentaries lean into moral clarity. Editorials argue over semantics. Was Klaus detained, hidden, neglected, erased? Each term carries legal implications, and so none is used definitively. The case exists in a grammar of evasion. Meanwhile, a parallel investigation begins quietly, focused not on Klaus himself, but on the mechanisms that allowed his status to remain unresolved for decades. This investigation uncovers a disturbing consistency. Whenever cases intersected with sensitive political thresholds, resolution was delayed until relevance expired. Files aged out. Witnesses moved on. Memory did the rest. Klaus Richter's case stands out not because it is unique, but because it failed to fade completely. Something about it kept resurfacing, resisting decay. Perhaps it was the lack of a body. Perhaps it was the persistence of his name in systems never fully scrubbed. Perhaps it was chance. Whatever the reason, the case became a fault line where institutional habits collided with modern expectations. As pressure mounts, the government issues what it calls a comprehensive acknowledgement. It admits that Klaus Richter's fate cannot be definitively established. It concedes that state actions contributed to prolonged uncertainty. It expresses regret. The statement is read aloud, archived, and criticized for everything it does not say. Families of other missing individuals react with fury. If Klaus's case remains unresolved after decades of scrutiny, what hope exists for theirs? The acknowledgement opens a floodgate of claims, demands, and appeals, stretching resources and patience. The state braces itself for a reckoning it has postponed for generations. Behind the scenes, one final effort is made to locate physical evidence. Advances in forensic genealogy offer a slim possibility. Samples from unidentified remains across multiple regions are reanalyzed, cross-referenced, compared against distant relatives. The process is slow, ethically fraught, and emotionally draining. Each negative result tightens the paradox. Klaus Richter is everywhere and nowhere. A lab technician, exhausted, remarks that the absence itself has become data. Most missing persons eventually intersect with something: a record, a body, a trace. Klaus does not. His disappearance is too clean. Not perfect, just clean enough to suggest management. This observation echoes through the panel's final sessions. They draft conclusions that read more like philosophy than law. Klaus Richter's case, they write, demonstrates how modern states can make individuals vanish without violence, without spectacle, without finality. Disappearance becomes a process, not an event, sustained by delay, diffusion, and denial. The panel recommends reforms. Oversight mechanisms, archival transparency, sunset clauses for unresolved detentions. The recommendations are praised, then quietly diluted. Implementation stalls. The machinery of governance absorbs the critique and continues. As the anniversary of Klaus's disappearance approaches its half-century mark, commemorations are planned. Exhibitions, talks, essays. Klaus Richter is invoked as a symbol, a cautionary tale. His face appears on posters, reconstructed from aging photographs, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the present. But symbols are blunt instruments. They simplify what should remain uncomfortable. And some who have followed the case closely resist this transformation. They argue that turning Klaus into a lesson risks completing the very erasure the investigation sought to undo. He becomes meaning rather than a man. On the night before the anniversary, a small group gathers quietly near the river. No cameras, no speeches, just names spoken aloud, including Klaus's, followed by others never recorded. The ritual is informal, unsanctioned, and profoundly unsettling in its simplicity. It suggests a form of remembrance that does not seek closure. The next day, headlines declare the case effectively concluded. No new evidence is expected. The cold case unit is reassigned. Resources shift elsewhere. The story recedes from the front page. And yet, beneath the surface, the unresolved tension remains. Klaus Richter's case has altered how absence is understood within the legal system. It has exposed vulnerabilities that cannot be unseen. It has demonstrated that resolution is not always the opposite of disappearance, and that sometimes the act of declaring a case solved merely relocates the mystery. As Berlin moves forward, building over its past, layering new narratives atop old foundations, Klaus Richter lingers as a question embedded in the infrastructure. Not a ghost haunting corridors, but a variable unaccounted for, a reminder that systems built to preserve order can also preserve uncertainty indefinitely. The case does not end. It settles. And in settling, it leaves behind a residue, a thin film of doubt coating every assurance that such things cannot happen again, because the true lesson of Klaus Richter was never about what happened in 1979, but about how easily a society can learn to live with not knowing, and call that peace. The final truth does not arrive like a confession or a discovery. It arrives like fatigue, a long exhale after decades of tension, because by the time the world stops asking where Klaus Richter went, it has already learned how to live without the answer, and that adaptation, quiet and complete, is the most unsettling outcome of all. The case that once cracked headlines now survives mostly as a reference point, a shorthand for something unresolved, invoked in lectures, cited in footnotes, spoken with a familiarity that disguises how little is actually known. What remains is not evidence, but atmosphere. In the months after the official conclusion, archivists notice a strange pattern. Requests for Klaus Richter. Related materials do not disappear. They multiply but shift in tone. No longer driven by outrage or urgency, they come from students, artists, researchers, people born long after 1979 who were never shocked by the original disappearance, but are deeply unsettled by the way it unfolded over time. They are not asking what happened to Klaus. They are asking how a system learned to forget him without ever erasing him. One doctoral candidate phrases it bluntly in a request letter. At what point does uncertainty become policy? That question echoes louder than any accusation. Because when the machinery stops turning, when committees dissolve and panels disband, when no further action is scheduled, Klaus Richter's case does something rare. It refuses to go cold. Not in the emotional sense, but in the technical one. It does not decay. It does not collapse into legend or myth. It remains stubbornly procedural, lodged inside filing systems, audit trails, half-redacted ledgers, its unresolved status radiating outward into adjacent cases like a low-frequency hum. A civil servant tasked with closing remaining loose ends admits privately that Klaus's file cannot be archived in the traditional sense. There is no terminal state to assign. Dead requires proof. Alive requires presence. Missing implies ongoing search. Klaus occupies none of these categories cleanly. His file exists in a liminal status that was never meant to persist this long. This administrative discomfort mirrors a deeper social one. Berlin, a city that has made an art form out of remembering, struggles with a case that resists narrative framing. There is no villain to condemn conclusively, no moment of revelation to anchor a museum exhibit, no resolution to offer visitors. Klaus Richter does not fit the grammar of memorialization, and yet his absence has shape. It appears in policies rewritten with excessive caution, in oversight committees granted unusual authority, in training manuals that warn against procedural stagnation. His name is never mentioned in those documents, but the imprint is unmistakable. Klaus becomes an invisible benchmark, the scenario no one wants to recreate, the silence no one wants to inherit. In this way, the case achieves a kind of afterlife more influential than closure ever could have been. Still, there are those who refuse to let the story settle into abstraction. A small network of independent researchers continues to revisit fragments long dismissed as noise. They are not chasing revelation anymore. They are mapping absence, tracing where records thin out, where processes slow, where decisions become collective enough to dissolve responsibility entirely. One of them describes Klaus Richter as a negative space figure. You cannot see him directly, but you can see what bends around him. Their work reveals something deeply uncomfortable. Klaus's case was not an anomaly. It was an early example. Later cases, smaller, quieter, learned from its mechanics. Delays refined. Language softened. Visibility reduced. The disappearance of Klaus Richter did not trigger reform immediately. It became a prototype. This realization never reaches the front page. It circulates quietly, academically, because to acknowledge it publicly would require a reckoning far broader than any single cold case could sustain. It would mean admitting that disappearance, once discovered, was not abolished, only optimized. A former intelligence analyst, now elderly, offers a final reflection in an interview conducted off the record. He says that the system did not fear exposure. It feared decisiveness. Decisions create fingerprints. Indecision creates fog. Klaus Richter, he says, was not lost in the fog. He was used to generate it. That sentence lingers long after the interview ends. Years pass. The plaza remains. The name remains. People walk over it without stopping, their footsteps polishing the letters smooth. Klaus Richter becomes part of the city's texture, as anonymous as any other historical scar, visible but no longer interrogated. Until one day, without announcement, the plaque beneath his name is altered. No press release explains it. No ceremony marks the change. A single line is added in smaller text, easy to miss. It does not declare him dead. It does not call him a victim. It reads only, status unresolved. The phrasing is deliberate. It resists resolution. It refuses the comfort of an ending. It is an admission carved into stone that the story remains open, not because no one tried to close it, but because closure itself proved inadequate. Visitors pause longer now. Some feel cheated. Others feel relieved. A few feel something closer to dread. Because unresolved does not mean unknown. It means uncontained. And that is where the case finally comes to rest, not in an answer, but in a condition. Klaus Richter is no longer just a man who vanished in 1979. He is a question permanently embedded in the architecture of accountability, a reminder that systems designed to protect can also preserve uncertainty indefinitely, and that time does not automatically produce truth, only distance. In the end, the most chilling realization is not that Klaus Richter disappeared, but that the world adjusted so well to his absence. That a society capable of outrage also proved capable of patience, of forgetting the urgency without forgetting the name, of accepting that some stories will never resolve cleanly. The cold case was never truly solved. It was reclassified, reframed, and ultimately absorbed. The new evidence did not rewrite history so much as expose how history is managed, how narratives are stabilized, how discomfort is stretched thin enough to become tolerable. Klaus Richter's legacy is not a conclusion. It is a warning written between the lines of official language, audible only to those who listen for what is not said, visible only to those who study where the record stops. And somewhere between the files that close and the questions that remain, between the plaque that names him and the silence that surrounds it, Klaus Richter continues to exist, not as a memory fading into the past, but as a disturbance that never quite goes away. A reminder that the most dangerous disappearances are not the ones that leave no trace, but the ones that leave just enough to haunt the future. After the plaque is altered, after the word unresolved settles into public space like a held breath, something subtle shifts in how the case behaves, because uncertainty, once acknowledged, becomes mobile, slipping out of official boundaries and into places where control is thinner, where memory is less disciplined. Klaus Richter stops being a case managed by institutions and becomes a signal picked up by people who have lived adjacent to silence their entire lives. It begins with letters. They arrive without pattern, addressed to archives, universities, journalists who once touched the story and moved on. Some are typed, others handwritten, many unsigned. None claim to solve anything. They share fragments. A train platform remembered without a date. A man with a foreign accent who asked the wrong questions. A patient in a long-term facility who never gave his name, but reacted violently to certain phrases. Individually, they mean nothing. Together, they form a low murmur, a chorus of almost recognition. For archivists trained to separate signal from noise, this is maddening. For those who have lived with the Klaus Richter case long enough, it feels familiar. This is how the truth behaves when it has been delayed too long. It does not arrive whole. It seeps. One letter stands out not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. It describes a civilian transport van, white, unmarked, seen repeatedly in the early 1980s outside a care complex never listed as secure. The writer recalls a man being helped out, thin, older than expected, his wrists scarred as if from restraints removed long ago. The man speaks once, quietly, in German, asking for a newspaper from before the wall fell, then corrects himself, apologizes, goes silent. The writer does not claim this man was Klaus Richter. They say only that the description matched photographs shown years later on television. They say they did not understand the significance at the time. They say they understand now. Investigators do not reopen the case officially. There is no mechanism left to do so. Instead, the letter is catalogued, cross-referenced, and placed into the expanding constellation of unresolved material that now surrounds Klaus like an atmosphere. The system no longer resists these additions. It absorbs them. Meanwhile, a parallel conversation unfolds outside formal channels. In forums, classrooms, private salons, Klaus Richter's name becomes shorthand for a type of disappearance that does not end. Not a vanishing, but a thinning, a gradual reduction of presence until a person exists only as a reference. Scholars argue that this form is more dangerous than overt violence because it produces no single moment of outrage, no clear threshold for intervention. The argument gains traction when a leaked internal memo surfaces, decades old, never intended for public release. It does not mention Klaus by name. It outlines a strategy for managing persistently unresolved individuals, recommending administrative continuity over resolution, citing reputational risk associated with definitive outcomes. The language is antiseptic. The implication is not. The memo confirms what many suspected but could never prove. Uncertainty was not merely tolerated. It was operational. Public reaction to the leak is sharp but brief. There are statements. There are calls for accountability. There are assurances that such practices no longer exist. And then attention shifts, as it always does. The revelation lacks spectacle. There is no villain to arrest. No door kicked in. No moment that satisfies the hunger for justice. Klaus Richter remains unresolved, but now the reason is clearer. Resolution was never the goal. As the years continue, the case settles into a strange duality. Officially dormant, culturally active. It appears in novels thinly disguised, in films where the missing man is never found, in art installations that use empty space as their central motif. Each iteration strips away specifics, leaving behind a shape that audiences recognize even if they do not know the name. And yet the name persists. On certain nights, small groups gather near the plaza, not as protests, not as memorials, but as something quieter. They read from documents aloud, dry language rendered human by voice. They speak dates, file numbers, classifications. They let the bureaucracy itself become the narrative, exposing how violence can hide inside procedure. Someone always reads Klaus Richter's identifier. It sounds colder than a name. That is the point. In one such gathering, a former junior official attends anonymously. They listen. They do not speak. Later, they submit a statement to an independent archive, sealed until after their death. In it, they describe a moment early in their career when they were instructed to carry a file from one office to another. Nothing unusual, except that the file was never to be logged. They were told it already existed everywhere it needed to exist. The file, they recall, bore Klaus Richter's name. They never saw the contents. They never asked. They understood the instruction perfectly. This statement does not change the legal status of the case. It cannot, but it changes something else. It confirms that Klaus Richter was not simply lost within a system. He was actively maintained in a state of perpetual processing. A man turned into a function, his existence reduced to circulation without destination. The realization is heavy. It reframes the entire arc of the story. Klaus Richter did not disappear into the past. He was carried forward, year after year, not as a living person, but as an unresolved task no one wanted to complete. In this light, the title that once promised clarity begins to read like an accusation. Solved, it turns out, was never about finding Klaus. It was about stabilizing the discomfort his absence caused. The new evidence did not rewrite history. It exposed how history had been edited in real time. As the final witnesses age and die, as documents reach the end of their classification periods and emerge incomplete, as memory thins, one truth hardens. There will be no final reveal. No recovered remains. No confession. Klaus Richter will never be located in the way stories usually demand. And yet he is not lost. He exists in the procedural gaps now marked and monitored because of his case. He exists in the hesitation officials feel when closing files too cleanly. He exists in the phrase status unresolved, a quiet rebellion against the demand for endings. The case ends not with silence, but with a kind of permanent noise, a static that cannot be tuned out, reminding anyone who listens closely that disappearance is not always an act of erasure. Sometimes it is an act of preservation, keeping a person just present enough to be controlled, just absent enough to be denied. Klaus Richter remains there, suspended between categories, neither found nor forgotten, not a ghost of the past but a pressure on the future, insisting, without words, that accountability does not expire, and that some stories are not meant to conclude, only to be carried forward unresolved. As long as systems exist that benefit from not deciding. Long after the letters slow and the gatherings thin, after the word unresolved has worn itself smooth through repetition, the case begins to exert its influence in a quieter, more consequential way, not through revelation but through prevention. Because the absence at the center of Klaus Richter's story becomes a reference point inside rooms where new decisions are made, rooms that never speak his name, but feel the weight of what happened when no one decided anything at all. It starts with hesitation. A junior official admits years later that when faced with a request to defer action on a sensitive file, they paused, not because policy demanded it, but because they had studied the Richter case in training, not as history, but as a cautionary abstraction. An example of what happens when ambiguity is allowed to harden into permanence. The official does not cite ethics. They cite risk. The system, once embarrassed by decisiveness, has learned to fear indeterminacy just as much. This is not redemption. It is recalibration. And even that recalibration is uneven. For every instance where Klaus Richter's shadow forces clarity, there are others where it is invoked as a warning against exposure, where officials argue that too much transparency can destabilize trust, where the memory of the case is used not to illuminate, but to restrain. Klaus becomes a double-edged reference, capable of cutting toward accountability or away from it, depending on who is holding the handle. The public rarely sees this tension. What they see instead are small changes that feel cosmetic, but are not. Forms revised. Categories expanded. New fields added where previously there had been none. Date last verified. Status reviewed. Authority confirming closure. The bureaucracy grows thicker, not thinner, layering safeguards on top of safeguards, trying to ensure that no individual can linger unresolved without triggering alarms. Yet thickness brings its own dangers. Complexity can obscure just as easily as simplicity once did. Some critics argue that the reforms inspired by Klaus Richter have created a new kind of fog, denser, more technical, accessible only to those fluent in its language. They warn that disappearance has not been eliminated, only made harder to recognize. These critiques circulate quietly, mostly ignored, until a minor scandal breaks involving an unrelated case, a missing contractor whose status drifts for years before anyone notices. The parallels are uncomfortable. Journalists reach for the familiar comparison. Klaus Richter's name surfaces again, less as an accusation than as a metric. How close did this come? How far did it go? The answer is inconclusive. It always is. What distinguishes Klaus's case is not that mistakes were made, but that they were sustained, defended, and normalized over time. The system did not fail once. It succeeded repeatedly in not resolving him. That is the lesson analysts struggle to articulate without sounding alarmist. A sociologist studying the case describes it as institutional muscle memory. Once a system learns that delay reduces risk, it will delay reflexively unless actively retrained. Klaus Richter, in this sense, is not a story about one man, but about a habit. This framing unsettles those who prefer to believe that history is corrected by exposure alone. It suggests that knowing what happened is insufficient. The mechanisms that allowed it must be continuously disrupted, or they will quietly reassert themselves. In private correspondence, some of the original investigators express a muted regret. Not that they failed to find Klaus, but that the case came to symbolize resolution without recovery. They worry that future generations will remember the headline more than the footnotes, the promise of being solved more than the admission that it never truly was. One investigator writes that the most dangerous outcome would be for Klaus Richter to become proof that the system works, that truth eventually emerges, that patience is rewarded. He insists the opposite is closer to reality. The system adapted because it was pressured, not because it was designed to correct itself. This distinction matters, because as time stretches on and direct memory of the Cold War recedes, the emotional charge surrounding Klaus Richter begins to fade, replaced by abstraction, by theory, by models and frameworks. Students debate his case without ever feeling the shock of his disappearance. Policymakers cite it without feeling the weight of the silence that followed. The risk is not forgetting Klaus Richter. The risk is misunderstanding him. Understanding arrives unexpectedly through an unlikely medium. A former contractor's family donates personal papers to a regional archive. Among them is a notebook filled with logistical notes, routes, schedules, nothing remarkable at first glance. But one entry, dated years after Klaus vanished, includes a line item marked only with an identifier, followed by the word continued. No context, no explanation. Archivists flag it. Analysts compare it. The identifier matches Klaus Richter's. The discovery does not prove survival. It does not prove detention. It does not prove anything definitively. But it reinforces a pattern now impossible to ignore. Klaus Richter was not resolved because he was still, in some form, active within the system long after he should have ceased to be relevant. Active does not mean alive. It means accounted for. This distinction reignites a debate thought exhausted. Can a person be administratively present without being physically so? And if they can, what obligations does that presence impose? There is no legal framework designed to answer this question. Laws assume bodies. Even the missing are anchored to the expectation of eventual discovery. Klaus Richter breaks this assumption. He existed as a maintained absence, a file that moved even when the person did not. A legal scholar proposes a term for this state: procedural captivity. Not imprisonment in the traditional sense, but confinement within systems that refuse to release an individual into any final category. The term gains traction, not because it is precise, but because it feels right. Under this lens, Klaus Richter was never free, regardless of his physical fate. His identity remained enclosed within administrative processes that neither acknowledged nor relinquished him. He was held not by walls, but by indecision. The implications ripple outward. If procedural captivity is possible, how many others have experienced it without notice? How many files circulate endlessly, unresolved, sustaining the illusion of management while eroding accountability? These questions do not lead to action. They lead to discomfort. And discomfort, as history has shown, is rarely sufficient to force change on its own. Still, the pressure accumulates. An international human rights body references Klaus Richter in a report on enforced disappearance, carefully phrased, non-accusatory but unmistakable. The report emphasizes that disappearance can occur without secrecy, without violence, without finality, through the slow accumulation of deferrals and classifications. Klaus Richter becomes an example cited beyond national borders, his case abstracted yet again, but now within a global vocabulary. This internationalization dilutes ownership. No single institution feels fully responsible anymore. Klaus Richter belongs to a category, not a country. And yet, back in Berlin, the plaza remains local, specific, unavoidable. Tourists photograph it without context. Residents pass it without looking. Occasionally, someone stops and reads the smaller line beneath the name. Status unresolved. That phrase begins to feel less like an admission and more like a challenge. Because unresolved is not neutral. It implies a failure to decide, and therefore an opportunity still open. It suggests that responsibility has not expired, that time has not absolved anyone, that the absence continues to demand attention. In this sense, Klaus Richter never needed to be found to exert force. His unresolved status has done more to alter behavior, provoke analysis, and expose structural weaknesses than many solved cases ever could. As one commentator writes, resolution comforts, unresolution interrogates. And so the case moves forward without moving at all, exerting pressure through its refusal to conclude, reminding those who encounter it that disappearance is not always about what is taken away, but about what is left hanging, unresolved, persistent, asking questions long after the appetite for answers has faded. Klaus Richter remains there, not at the center of the story anymore, but at its edge, where systems meet their limits, where language frays, where certainty gives way to process, and where the most unsettling truth finally settles in. That a society can learn to live not just with unanswered questions, but with unanswered people, and call that stability, unless something keeps reminding it that unresolved is not an ending, but an ongoing condition. By the time the case drifts into what scholars call its post-investigative life, the urgency that once defined it has thinned into something more abstract, but no less corrosive, because Klaus Richter is no longer a problem to be solved. He is a benchmark quietly consulted whenever institutions are tempted to let time do their work for them. His absence has become instructional, not dramatic, and that may be its most dangerous transformation. The shift is subtle. It happens not through announcements or reforms, but through habit. When files linger too long without review, someone invokes precedent. When a missing individual's status becomes inconvenient to clarify, someone asks whether clarity is necessary. The Richter case hovers in these conversations like a caution sign no one wants to describe aloud. In this phase, the story sheds nearly all of its human detail. Klaus Richter's childhood photographs, his voice, his last known movements fade from circulation. What remains is structure, flowcharts, decision trees, timelines annotated with delays rather than actions. Klaus becomes a process rather than a person, and that abstraction, while analytically useful, risks repeating the very erasure that made the case possible. A cultural historian points out the irony. The case is now taught in administrative ethics courses not as a tragedy, but as a systems failure model. Students are asked to identify points of intervention, to propose safeguards to optimize outcomes. Klaus Richter's life is reduced to a scenario, his disappearance a problem set. Some find this necessary. Others find it obscene. The tension comes to the surface when a proposal emerges to digitize and algorithmically monitor unresolved cases across multiple agencies. A system designed to flag prolonged ambiguity before it hardens into permanence. Proponents argue it is precisely what the Richter case demands. Critics warn that automating vigilance risks automating indifference, that a system designed to watch for absence may normalize it further. The debate is fierce, technical, and telling. Klaus Richter's name appears in white papers, stripped of narrative, used as justification on both sides. His unresolved status has become evidence that can be interpreted in opposing ways, a mirror reflecting the priorities of whoever is looking. Amid this abstraction, a moment of unsettling concreteness intrudes. A maintenance crew renovating a defunct administrative building discovers a sealed cabinet hidden behind a false wall. Inside are folders damaged by time and moisture, most illegible, some empty. One remains partially intact. It does not contain a full file, only a cover sheet, brittle and yellowed, bearing a familiar identifier and a handwritten note in the margin. Do not finalize. No date. No signature. The discovery sends a quiet ripple through those still paying attention. It is not evidence of survival. It is not proof of detention. It is confirmation of intent. Someone at some point decided that Klaus Richter's case must remain open, not temporarily, but deliberately. The instruction is not to investigate further, but to refrain from ending. This reframes everything again. The unresolved status was not merely the result of delay or fear. It was at least once an active choice. A decision to preserve uncertainty rather than confront consequence. Officials declined to comment publicly. Privately, some admit the note is consistent with practices of the era, where finalization triggered oversight, audits, accountability. Leaving a case perpetually incomplete allowed it to exist without consequence, a problem suspended in administrative amber. The realization lands heavily. Klaus Richter was not just forgotten. He was held in suspension. This understanding filters slowly into public discourse, not through headlines, but through essays, lectures, conversations that resist easy outrage. The story is no longer shocking. It is instructive in a quieter, more unsettling way. The concept of deliberate incompletion begins to circulate. Scholars argue that modern systems are uniquely capable of sustaining unresolved states indefinitely, that closure is optional, not inevitable. Klaus Richter's case becomes the canonical example of how non-decision can function as control. This idea resonates beyond historical analysis. Activists draw parallels to contemporary cases where individuals remain in legal limbo, neither charged nor cleared, neither present nor absent. They argue that Klaus Richter is not a relic, but a warning still relevant. Institutions push back, insisting that safeguards exist now, that transparency has improved, that such prolonged uncertainty would be impossible. The arguments sound familiar, too familiar. As these debates unfold, the physical traces of the case continue to erode. Buildings are repurposed. Offices become apartments. Archives relocate. Each move risks loss, not through destruction, but through dilution. Klaus Richter's file grows thinner, more symbolic than material. Yet the symbol refuses to settle. A playwright stages a production built entirely from bureaucratic language. Actors reading memos, directives, redactions aloud under harsh light. Klaus Richter's name appears once, fleetingly, buried in a paragraph. The audience reacts more strongly to that moment than to any dramatic flourish. The absence, made audible, is unbearable. The play does not explain the case. It does not need to. The power lies in recognition, in the realization that violence can be procedural, that disappearance can be managed rather than enacted. Critics call the production uncomfortable, slow, unresolved. They mean it as criticism. Others recognize it as fidelity, because unresolved has always been the truest descriptor of the case. As time continues to stretch, Klaus Richter's story begins to intersect with a broader cultural fatigue. People tire of complexity, of ambiguity, of stories without endings. There is pressure, subtle but persistent, to let the case rest, to accept that not everything can be known, that some questions must remain unanswered. This pressure is not malicious. It is human. But it is precisely this impulse that allowed the disappearance to persist in the first place. The desire for quiet, the acceptance of not knowing, the willingness to move on without resolution. Those who continue to resist closure understand this. They do not demand answers anymore. They demand attention. Attention to process. Attention to language. Attention to the ways systems can choose not to decide. In this final stage, Klaus Richter ceases to belong to investigators, historians, or even the public. He belongs to the space between decisions, to the pause that becomes permanent if left unchallenged. His case is no longer about what happened in 1979. It is about what has been happening ever since. And as long as files can remain unfinalized, as long as uncertainty can be treated as neutral, as long as unresolved can be mistaken for acceptable, Klaus Richter will continue to exist, not as a man waiting to be found, but as a condition waiting to be confronted. A reminder etched not just into stone or paper, but into the habits of governance themselves, insisting, without ever seeing daylight, that the most enduring disappearances are the ones we decide not to end. In the years that follow, the case enters a phase no one anticipated, not revival and not decay, but normalization, the moment when something unresolved becomes familiar enough to stop provoking alarm. And that is when Klaus Richter's absence grows most dangerous, because it no longer shocks. It instructs quietly, shaping expectations about what can be left undone. It happens gradually. A file left open too long no longer triggers urgency, only a note. A missing status lingering past review cycles becomes a footnote. Klaus Richter's name, once radioactive, becomes a reference used to justify patience. These things take time, someone says, meaning years, meaning decades, meaning indefinitely. The system has learned how to carry unresolved weight without collapsing under it. This is not indifference. It is adaptation. Sociologists studying institutional behavior describe this stage as equilibrium. The system has absorbed the anomaly and recalibrated around it. Klaus Richter is no longer a threat to legitimacy. He is proof that legitimacy can survive without answers. That realization spreads silently, far beyond the boundaries of his original case. A new generation of administrators inherits the framework without the memory. They know the procedures, not the fear that created them. They are taught that ambiguity must be managed, not eliminated, that decisiveness can be destabilizing, that silence, when properly documented, is defensible. Klaus Richter is never mentioned in their training, but his imprint is everywhere. This generational shift marks a turning point. The case stops being a warning and becomes infrastructure. It is at this moment that resistance reappears, not from investigators or journalists, but from archivists. Those tasked with preserving records notice something subtle but alarming. Files related to unresolved cases are being compressed, summarized, abstracted. Original materials are replaced with metadata. Context is sacrificed for efficiency. Klaus Richter's case, already thin, risks becoming nothing but an index entry pointing to itself. Archivists protest quietly. They argue that compression is a form of erasure, that summarizing unresolved histories strips them of the very friction that makes them dangerous. Their warnings are technical, not moral, and therefore easy to ignore. Until one archive refuses. A regional repository declines to condense Klaus Richter's materials into the new standardized format. They insist on preserving redundancies, contradictions, incomplete forms, handwritten notes, everything that resists neat categorization. Their justification is simple. The mess is the meaning. The refusal draws attention. Funding is threatened. Audits are announced. The archive stands its ground. Unexpectedly, public support materializes, not loud but persistent. Scholars, writers, even former officials argue that Klaus Richter's case must remain unwieldy, because it demonstrates what happens when systems prioritize order over truth. The standoff ends quietly. An exception is granted. Klaus Richter's archive remains intact, bloated, unresolved, resistant to closure. This small victory carries symbolic weight. It suggests that unresolved does not have to mean unattended, that a case can capture attention precisely by refusing to resolve into something consumable. Inspired by this, similar exceptions are requested elsewhere. Not all are granted, but the idea takes hold. Unresolution is preservation. Complexity is safeguard. Still, the broader system continues its work. New policies emerge that promise to prevent future Richter-like cases. Time limits, mandatory reviews, external oversight. On paper, they are robust. In practice, they rely on the same mechanisms of compliance and interpretation that once allowed Klaus Richter to disappear administratively. The architecture has changed. The incentives have not. A policy analyst notes this contradiction in a paper that circulates briefly before fading. Rules can mandate action, she writes, but they cannot mandate courage. Klaus Richter's case was not sustained by the absence of regulation, but by the presence of fear. This insight lands softly, without impact, because fear is difficult to legislate. As anniversaries pass without ceremony, the plaza bearing Klaus Richter's name grows ordinary. Children play nearby. Markets set up and dismantle. Life continues. The unresolved status becomes part of the scenery, like scaffolding no one remembers the purpose of. And yet, occasionally, someone new encounters the case without insulation. A student stumbles across the archive and reads it end to end. A filmmaker fixates on the absence of an ending. A civil servant pauses before closing a file and feels an inexplicable hesitation. These moments are small, private, and impossible to measure. But they are where the case still lives. Because Klaus Richter's story was never about spectacle. It was about endurance. The endurance of systems that prefer not to decide. The endurance of uncertainty tolerated long enough to feel normal. The endurance of a name carried forward without a body, without proof, without permission to end. Toward the end of this phase, a quiet reclassification occurs. Not of Klaus Richter himself, but of how unresolved cases are described in internal language. The term pending is replaced with ongoing condition. The shift seems semantic. It is not. Pending implies an eventual outcome. Ongoing condition does not. This linguistic adjustment passes unnoticed by the public. Internally, it is understood perfectly. Some things are no longer waiting to be resolved. They are expected to persist. Klaus Richter has crossed that threshold. He is no longer a question the system expects to answer. He is a condition the system expects to manage. That realization settles heavily on those who still pay attention. Because once unresolved becomes acceptable, it becomes reproducible. The Richter case ceases to be singular and becomes a template, not formally, not intentionally, but functionally. And this is where the true danger lies. Not in what happened to Klaus Richter, but in what was learned from it. That a disappearance does not require violence. That accountability can be postponed indefinitely. That memory can be preserved without justice. That a name can remain visible while the person behind it vanishes completely. As long as these lessons remain embedded in practice, Klaus Richter is not finished. He is not history. He is precedent. The case continues not in archives or plazas, but in habits, in language, in the quiet comfort with which unresolved states are accepted as stable. And until that comfort is disturbed, until uncertainty is once again treated as an emergency rather than a condition, Klaus Richter will remain exactly where he has always been, suspended, unresolved, enduring, a reminder that the most lasting disappearances are not the ones no one remembers, but the ones everyone learns to live with. The last phase does not announce itself. There is no marker, no shift in tone, no official recognition that something has ended, because what finally settles around the Klaus Richter case is not resolution, but inheritance. The unanswered question is passed forward, absorbed into the future the way unresolved debt is absorbed into economies, quietly reshaping behavior long after the original transaction is forgotten. By now, few people actively search for Klaus Richter. That search ended years ago, not with failure, but with exhaustion. What continues instead is management. His name appears in risk assessments, in ethics modules, in quiet conversations between people who understand that systems do not correct themselves unless forced. Klaus Richter has become an internal reference point, a boundary marker no one wants to cross again, yet no one is certain how to avoid. This uncertainty is crucial, because the final lesson of the case is not that disappearance is possible, but that it is sustainable. Once a system proves it can carry an unresolved human absence indefinitely, that capacity does not disappear. It waits. It adapts. It presents itself as caution, as prudence, as patience. Years after the last investigation closes, a policy workshop convenes to discuss long-term accountability in administrative systems. Klaus Richter's case is mentioned once, briefly, as background. No one debates the facts. They debate thresholds. How long is too long? When does delay become harm? At what point does process become abuse? No consensus is reached. The absence of consensus is framed as complexity. It is not treated as failure. The participants leave satisfied that the issue has been acknowledged. Klaus Richter, once again, has done his work without changing anything decisively. Outside those rooms, life continues with indifference that is neither cruel nor kind. The plaza remains. The plaque remains. The phrase status unresolved remains, now so familiar it barely registers. It has lost its sharpness, which is exactly what time does to discomfort when it is not transformed into action. And yet, the case is not dormant. It is latent. Every unresolved disappearance that follows carries an echo. Every file left open too long resonates faintly with Klaus Richter's name, even when it is not spoken. His case has altered the baseline, shifted expectations about what can be tolerated. That shift cannot be undone by acknowledgement alone. A philosopher writes that unresolved cases function like negative monuments. They do not commemorate what happened. They commemorate what failed to happen. Justice not delivered. Decisions not made. Responsibility not assumed. Klaus Richter's plaque is not a memorial to a man. It is a memorial to hesitation. This interpretation unsettles some and comforts others. For those who believe institutions can improve, it serves as a warning. For those who believe they cannot, it serves as confirmation. As the decades extend further, Klaus Richter's name appears less frequently in public discourse. He is no longer timely. He is no longer clickable. The story has exhausted its narrative energy. What remains is its structural impact, invisible but persistent. In this way, the case achieves a final, unsettling completeness. Not because the truth is known, but because the absence has been fully integrated. Klaus Richter no longer disrupts the system. He is part of it. That is the ending no one wanted and no one prevented. The unresolved status, once a temporary placeholder, has become permanent. Not officially, not ceremonially, but functionally. There will be no new evidence that changes everything. There will be no confession waiting in a drawer. There will be no moment when the story snaps into clarity. And that is precisely the point. The final rewrite of history promised by the headline never arrives as a revelation. It arrives as recognition. Recognition that history is not rewritten by facts alone, but by what societies choose to close and what they choose to leave open. Klaus Richter's case was not solved because solving it was never the most important outcome. Managing its consequences was. In the end, Klaus Richter exists not as a victim located in time, but as a pressure exerted across time. He presses on language, on policy, on memory. He exposes the comfort of delay and the danger of patience. He reminds anyone willing to look closely that unresolved is not neutral, that it is an active state with real effects. The cold case does not end with silence or truth. It ends with continuity, with systems still capable of deciding not to decide, with people still willing to accept that capacity as normal, with a name still visible and a fate still withheld. Klaus Richter never returned. He was never found. He was never conclusively lost. Instead, he remained. A man transformed into an ongoing condition. A disappearance preserved by process. A warning embedded so deeply it no longer alarms. And that is the final, most chilling resolution of the Berlin 1979 cold case. Not that history was rewritten, but that it learned how to keep writing around the absence, indefinitely, quietly, efficiently, until unresolved stopped feeling like a failure and started feeling like a state of order. The case is over. The condition remains.